Good morning and welcome. My name is Laura Wells, and I am the Executive Director of Hope, North Carolina. And I have to say, the excitement in the room is palpable to me. I hope it is to you as well. It's just great to be together for this very first Inclusive Housing Summit. So thank you for being here. We're going to have a couple of opening remarks to get us started. So I'd like to invite Mayor Pam Heminger up to say a few words. And she's from the town of Chapel Hill, Mayor Pam Heminger.
Good morning, everyone, and I agree. I love the energy in this room and the fact that the room is packed. It's wonderful. On behalf of Town of Chapel Hill, I am very, very pleased to welcome all of you here. I know not all of you are from Chapel Hill, so we hope those that are visiting will stay a while and linger and get to know us a little better. I have a few council members here with me today. Over here, I have Councilmember Paris Miller-Fouché. And I saw Councilmember Camille Berry, I think. She's getting food, okay. And did I miss anyone? But yeah, okay. No, but I'm very, very happy you're here. I'm so happy that these conversations that started many years ago, as Dottie was saying, an idea in the basement of Chapel Hill Library, and it has grown. We really, really appreciate when people advocate for people who may not be able to advocate for themselves, but we want to hear those voices, and we want to be able to be that inclusive place that we really strive to be. We need to create more diverse housing in our communities. I know you've all seen the pressures of growth in this region. It's incredible. It's a lot of growth, and we don't want to leave anyone out. We want to make sure that we are that place that welcomes everybody, no matter what walk of life you come from. We want to be able to do that. So in Chapel Hill, and to help us move forward, we've been working with a team of consultants to create what we are calling complete communities. It's a strategy and an action plan focused on how much housing is needed. We actually lack housing in Chapel Hill. I'm sure that's a shock of those who live here. And where that housing should go and how we achieve our goals of affordability and accessibility, as well as creating that housing. It also has a whole strategy of how people get around our community. As we add more housing, we don't want to add more cars. So we want more options for people to walk, bike, take transit, and doing so safely. And so we've engaged with many different individuals and stakeholders in the community. I have several meetings say, I'm sorry, I can't stay. I want to stay for this conference, but I can't. Several others, including Complete Communities today. And we're continuing to have those conversations, and I know that some members of PASID have been involved in those conversations. For Hope and the families, I know what Community Reimagined looks like, and I know what, as a council, we're trying to embrace this in our work. And for those in the audience from other towns, I'll share that I am chair of the Metropolitan Mayors across North Carolina. It is something that all communities are working on. We are having these discussions across the state as well, as different mayors are experiencing the same kinds of growth in their cities. And I'd like to share often that in the state of North Carolina, the population has just exploded, but it's been mostly in the cities. Most of our rural areas have actually lost population. And so people are moving into the cities, which is causing part of this housing crisis. But people are moving here from all over the country and actually all over the world. So governments can't do this alone. And we value all the opportunities to share ideas and partner with groups like Hope and other groups to make that housing and that inclusivity a reality. And I'm really glad that you're here together talking across with each other from other areas of the community, and you're making a difference. You really are. I know sometimes it feels slow and that you want to move faster, but please be persistent. Please continue to advocate. Please show up at the table. Please make your demands heard as you advocate for those folks who need all the things that some of us take for granted. As a lot of you in the audience know, I grew up with a sister with Down syndrome. And we were fortunate as a family that we were able to find housing for her in Atlanta. It was hard. We had to go outside of Atlanta to find housing in a community which she thrived and loved. But that's not an option for everyone, and there's not that many communities even in the country that afford that. So I really do understand the challenges that families face as they're looking for options for their loved one to be part of a community, to be cared for in a community, and to know that that will continue, that community support will continue long after we can't care for our own loved ones that are here. And so Chapel Hill wants to be that kind of place. We really do, but we need help. And we lean on groups like Hope and PASSIT and all the different groups to help us understand how, what, where, and who we need to create community for. So I want to help you move from being worried stage to being activist stage and getting things accomplished. And you need to put pressure on all of your local governments. Like I said, we can't do it alone, but we need to hear your voices repeatedly. So enjoy the conference today. Help find those solutions that help all of us achieve the places and the communities that we want for all of our loved ones. And I so appreciate and respect all that you're doing and want to be here to help you champion it as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayor Heminger. Now I'd like to invite, we have our state representative here today, Kenneth Bassell, who is the IDD manager for the North Carolina Department of Medicaid. Thank you, Kenneth, for being here.
Thank you. Hey everybody, can everybody hear me okay? Okay, thank you all so much for having me today. Again, it's great to see all this energy in the room and just see so many faces that are interested in this type of work and support. So again, my name is Kenneth Bassell, and I work for North Carolina Medicaid, and I lead a small team that supports people with intellectual developmental disabilities, autism spectrum, and traumatic brain injury. I think that, something that I just wanted to say is that we know that it's best for people to receive supports that they need in the community, right? And that helps them maintain their life in the community. It's also really, really important for that community life and that support to be in the community because it helps a person become further ingrained in their community, become part of their community. And that just makes life better for everybody, right? And then I think if we think about that, then a person with a developmental disability or traumatic brain injury, if they're living in their community, if they're ingrained in their community, then they're going to be able to support other people who are their community friends and their community partners. And then they're also going to be able to leverage support from other people who are those community friends and community partners. And that could be anything. I think oftentimes in our Medicaid world, we think of support as that one-to-one person giving that support. But it also can be just helping someone take the trash down. It could be doing some of that emotional labor with someone to really just do what we all do when we think of community. And I think that kind of reciprocal relationship is really, really important and is one of the reasons I think that what Mayor Heminger was talking about is why people come to some of our more urban areas, because there are more people around, there are more connections for people. So really just trying to make sure that community connection continues to go. At DHHS, we're continued and are committed to furthering and bolstering our community-based services. One of those services that I think a lot of people in this room are probably interested in is our supported living definition through our North Carolina Innovations Waiver. And that service allows people with a person with an intellectual and developmental disability to live in the community in their own home that they may either rent or own, and they can live by themselves or with a roommate. And that's a really important service definition and something that we really want to grow and see more and more people take advantage of because it gives people more ownership over their life, right? They have more control over what's happening in their house. They have more control over what staff are doing with them. They don't have to really conform to either rules of an out-of-home placement like a group home, or they don't have to conform to rules maybe of their family. And I think that was really important for me of moving out of my family home, as I didn't have to kind of deal with the tensions of what my parents wanted and what I wanted. And, I think that's normal for everybody. So I think supported living can really help bridge that community life. Going back to Mayor Heminger's comments, I think that's something that's really important about community living is also having affordable housing options. Like if we want to support people to live in the community, there also has to be affordable housing options for them to go to. And it's not just for people with disabilities who need those affordable housing options. It's really also really important for our direct care professionals because if we want to sustain more people living in the community, We need to have those direct support professionals who are integral to the, life, and we want those people to live in the same types of communities that the people that they're serving are. So it's really continuing to make that community life a reality. So again, I applaud you all for getting all of this together today and coming up with different ways to think about diverse housing, to think about community and how community actually emerges from the earth and changes based on who lives there. One other thing I just wanted to talk about too is that our further commitment for community-based living is we're working to get approved by the federal government a package of services called 1915I services. One of those services is community living and supports, which allows people to get support in the home and in the community, right? With that said, we hope to be able to provide more supports to people with developmental disabilities than we currently are, either in our Innovations Waiver Program or in our developmental disability package of services in general. And with that, of course, there are going to be people who choose to live on their own. There are going to be people who choose to live in different areas. So we really need to get this affordable housing, diverse housing situation, have more really abilities to support people in different housing opportunities. And then again, that goes back to that staffing piece, is we really need to be able to support our direct care staff professionals who are supporting individuals as well. So it's a healthy continuum across the board. But again, thank you all for having me today. I should be here the majority of the day. I might have to pop out, but very excited to be here and to see everybody. But thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kenneth. And that prompts me, his talking about Medicaid prompts me to say a big thank you to all of our sponsors that you see listed that made this day possible, but especially a big shout out to UNC CARES, kind of got cut off on the left-hand side, but the CARES program from the School of Social Work administered a grant through NC Medicaid. The money follows the person, provided the money. That a large majority of this summit came from that support. So big thank you to MFP, Money Follows the Person, and UNC CARES, and all our other amazing sponsors, many of whom are here today. If you see them with a red ribbon on their name tag, please give them an extra thank you. Before we get started, a couple of business notes for you. Just want to make sure everyone saw the bathroom location right outside these two doors here on either side of the doors. The breakfast, any food you see out there, they've assured us either station is available, as well as the drinks. The breakfast food and drinks will be out there only till 10:30. So if you didn't get a chance coming in to grab anything, feel free to sneak out. We won't have a break from these morning presentations until 11. So we won't be upset if you sneak out to get some food before it goes away at 10:30. In your packet, you have a handout with a Wi-Fi code, although I think the guest doesn't require a password, but if it does, it's in there. And also this Slido information that you see on your screen. Everybody, if you have a smartphone, take it out, and you can scan the QR code that's in your packet on the page that has the Slido information, or you can just go to whatever browser you use, and go ahead and do this now. We're going to do a practice question, and enter in slido.com on your phone. So that's all you have to do in your web browser, whether it's Safari, or if you have an Android, it might be Google Chrome, and just enter in slido.com, and then you'll see it'll ask you for a participant code, and you're going to put in these numbers: 2847425. So I'll give you a second to get there, and then we'll do a practice question. Maybe. There we go. Okay. Oh, you need the number back? Okay. Oh, yep, it's still there. There it is. See, can everyone see it? It's smaller now. 2847425. All right. Most everybody got it. I know it's not. If you can't get it, you'll get the next one. All right. So go ahead, in 1 or 2 words. You should have this prompt now. Well, how are you feeling today? And we'll see. We should see. Hello. Come on. So look. All right. So the words get bigger the more people put them in. So I think. What did someone put? Oh, that's great. Yay! Awesome. Everybody's feeling good, excited, hopeful, encouraged. We have some people that are feeling anxious. I'm with you. I didn't put it in, but I'm with you, whoever that is. Anxious, overwhelmed. I'm a little overwhelmed too. Energized. Great. All right. So y'all did great. Good job. All right. There is a next question, if it'll go. Let's see. Wants to make me really work for it. Okay. So for this question, you have more than one option you can pick. How do you describe yourself? Describe your role. Are you here today? Are you a parent or a caregiver of someone with a disability? Again, you can choose more than one. Are you a person with lived experience of disability? Are you an older adult over age 55? We're using a very loose older adult here. So professional in the housing field, professional in the disability field, and professional in the aging field. So let's see as your responses come in. Here we go. Real time, I love it. So we've got a lot of people who are a family member of someone with a disability, professional in the disability field. So somebody tell me what is the professional in the housing field? How many percent? It's 19. Okay, 19% of people. Oh, there it is. Housing field, disability field. What are we missing? Aging. And what's the aging? 11. Thank you. All right, so that's what we've got here today.
We have some others too who don't fit in this.
Yeah, and they're probably, should have been in other. Advocate or care passionately about these topics, and we're so grateful that the others are here as well. So, one thing, the reason why I wanted to do this slide is we at Hope know that we can't do what we want to do without a bunch of support and across many sectors. So we need not only people in the housing field and aging field and disability field, but our advocates, our local professionals, we need business folks, real estate people. We need everybody to make this work, and that's part of our grant through UNC Cares and Money Follows the Person is to do collective impact work so that we can really use the expertise of everyone across sectors. So what is Hope's mission? Hope's mission is to create inclusive communities where people of all ages and abilities experience a sense of belonging. Most of you know that Hope was founded in 2018 by 3 amazing women, and they're all kind of lurking on the side here. Dottie Foley, Aura Rea, and Ginny Dropkin. And I have the honor and privilege to work. I have the honor and privilege to get to work with them every day, and they are tireless advocates who have made Hope into a reality from that dream that the mayor alluded to in the basement of Chapel Hill those many years ago in 2018. So Hope is, they founded Hope because they, as parents of adults with autism, they felt like there just weren't enough options for housing for their loved ones, or the options that they were looking for did not exist. And they wanted their adult children to have to be able to really be a part of the community, not just have a bed or live in the community, but to really feel like they belong. So that's what today is about. 72% of people from a survey, in a national survey that was done a couple years ago, 72% of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the United States live with their family members. And 25% of those family members that are caring for loved ones are over the age of 60. So obviously this is not a long-term sustainable solution. What happens when those loved ones are no longer around? And I'm sure many of you in this room feel that anxiety every day if you're a parent of a child that is an adult and you're not sure, what will happen to them. And that's how Hope was founded, to create some other solutions. The options that currently exist if you don't live with your family are typically to live in a group home or a setting where you have multiple people with disabilities and you have staff that rotate in. And not everyone wants to live in that kind of setting. That's not for everyone. And when adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities want to live on their own, supports are often not available. And as Kenneth talked about, certainly trying to provide those kind of supports through Medicaid, but as we know, the state has a long waiting list to even receive those supports. So HOPE's plan is to build inclusive, affordable, intergenerational communities to provide another option for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. All right, so you get another Slido poll. If you put your phone away, don't do it because you're going to get to participate. No. It's funny when people want you to keep your phone out, right? That's not usual. So, okay, what does the word community mean to you? Hopefully you're seeing it on your screen, and let's see if I can actually get a word cloud to come up this time. There we go. What does community mean to you? There's no right or wrong answer, and it can be more than one word. Belonging seems to be, you're in the right place, right? Our summit today is called Belonging in the Community. So, yeah, belonging is definitely coming out. And connection, I like those two words too. Connection. No judgment, interdependence, caring, relational, collaborative, acceptance, together. Extended family, yeah. These are some great words. This is beautiful. So for us at Hope, community means a place where you live, where you feel valued and appreciated and useful, like you belong to someone or something. And that's really what we all want. And some of us may have that in our lives now. You maybe have extended family or friends nearby where you live. You may have neighbors, people that know you, that look out for you. But many adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities don't have this. They have paid staff that come in and care for them. But friends and neighbors and people that care are what make our lives meaningful. And we all realized that during the pandemic, didn't we? When we couldn't see people and we couldn't connect other than on a screen, which we all know is not the same. We're so glad to have an in-person meeting with all of you here because it's so different to see you face to face and to connect in a way. And that's really what community is about to us at Hope and what we are striving to create. I met a young woman a few weeks ago. I'll call her Willow. That's not her real name, but she was sharing with me at our community gathering that we have, once a month with Hope, that she was anxious or nervous about moving. And I asked her, why she was nervous, and she said she was moving into a group home. And I, never having met her, asked her why. Or I asked her, do you want to live in a group home? And she said, no, I'm not really sure. I've lived in my own apartment for the past 15 years. And last year, my roommate had to move out and go live in a group home because she had some medical issues come up and she needed more support and couldn't live here with me anymore. So I've been living alone for the past year and a half, and I am lonely. She kept saying that. She repeated that maybe 10 times. I am lonely. My guardian decided I have to go live in a group home. And she said that several times. And it just really struck me as sad listening to her talk. She said, I don't know how I'm going to handle living with 6 people. I just, this is the life. And it struck me as so very sad because she is very independent. She's very capable. She obviously, lives on her own and can make it work with whatever supports, she has currently. So the fact that someone else made the decision that she had to go live in a group home because she was lonely, right? How many of us are lonely on a regular basis? I get lonely. I mean, I do, let's be honest. And no one is telling me, well, you better go live in a group home. You're gonna have to live in a group home because you're lonely. You don't have any friends in this neighborhood. We just moved here in 2020 and didn't know any of our neighbors, didn't know anybody, but nobody said to me, well, you're lonely, you gotta go live in a group home. This is where you say there are not enough options. If somebody is just needing that connection, that belonging, That's what Hope wants to be, more than just a place to live, but a place where people like Willow, if she lived in a Hope community and she didn't have a roommate, she'd be fine because she would be connected and feel like she belongs and not lonely. All right, join the quiz. You ready for your test now? This is not a test. This is just to get a feel of the room. Slido again. That you will see, I hope. Come on, quiz. No, that's a word cloud. What the? That's weird. No, it asked for your name. That's weird. Oh, it wants to create this leaderboard, which I swear I shut off in the settings to show who the winner of the quiz is. So, all right, y'all, now you're going to be shown. I'm sorry, because I really did try to turn that part off. All right, so, okay, here we go. It's now showing the right thing. So this is the first question. According to the CDC, what percentage of adults in the United States have some type of disability? So this is physical, emotional, mental, cognitive, any kind of disability. And the answers are either 25%, 40%, 15%, or 5%, so pick one. And I'm supposed to show you as the votes come in real time. Here we go. Okay. I like watching the little things move up and down, but I keep getting the slide too slow to do it. So, okay. So it looks like most people think 40%, and the second runner-up is 25%. So we'll go to the next. So you can see the answer is 25%. So it's 1 in 4 adults, according to the CDC, has some type of disability. So if you look around this room, there are 165 people registered, right? Or you can just count, like every 4 people. And I probably in this room, knowing this crowd, it's probably more than 1 in every 4, right? I mean, I have a disability, so I, fall in that category. It's a huge problem. Not a problem. We are not a problem. I didn't mean that. But there's a great need. Okay, so how many adults in the United States have an intellectual disability? 1 million, 10 million, 7 million, or 5 million? Let's see if I can get the slide before you all answer. Here we go.
Yeah, when you show it.
Oh, when I show it, it closes. That's not fair. Oh, okay. Well, next time I'm not going to show you. No, okay. So of the people that didn't get closed out, 39% of you feel like it's 7 million, and 22% think it's 10 million, and 5 million got some votes. Yep, okay. So the answer is 7 million. So y'all got it right. Good job. All right. So for what region of the United States is the disability population the highest? Oh, and the choices are north, south, east, or west. Everybody get a chance to vote before I close it? All right, let's see. You guys are very smart. It's the South. Yes, it is. It's the South. And in North Carolina, I think the latest data that the Council on Developmental Disabilities put out in their 5-year plan was 197,000 people in North Carolina have intellectual and developmental disabilities. But that was a few years ago of data, so we don't know what it is today. We would like to know. All right, so the next question is the last question of the quiz. In the triangle, Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, if your sole income is Social Security income, what percentage of your income would you have to spend to rent a 1-bedroom apartment? Is it 80%, 90%, 100%, or 120%? Ready? I'm about to close it out. I'll give you a few more seconds. If you haven't voted, vote. All right, so we've got, it's hiding down below. Darn it. And thank you. I was going to say I can't scroll on here for some reason. So 47% of people think it's 120%. 24% of people think it's 100%. So you're right. So yep, you guys are good at this. Well, you can't see the right answer is indeed 120%. So in North Carolina, Social Security income right now is $854 per month. And as we all know, the rents in this particular area in the triangle to rent a 1-bedroom apartment is about, at minimum, $1,000 and can go up pretty high, even beyond that. So if, let's say it was $1,000, your $854 is not even going to pay your rent, let alone thinking about food and everything else. So obviously, when we talk about a lack of affordable housing, the people that suffer the most are those living on Social Security income. That includes older adults. That includes many people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and others who can't work for other reasons as well. Here's your leaderboard. Yeah, congratulations, Jim and Hannah. You guys are good. We'll give you your prize later. I don't know what that will be, but all right. So what are inclusive communities? HOPE's concept is building a housing development where 25% of the units would be set aside for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, 40% would be set aside for older adults, and the remaining would be a mix of families and individuals. We want people like Willow, who I talked about, to live in their own apartment if they want, have a roommate if they want. So, a 2-bedroom apartment could have a roommate if they choose. But again, it's about choice. It's about everybody needs to have a choice of where they want to live, how they want to live. The intergenerational piece, we believe, is really important. When you have all ages of people living near each other and interacting and engaging and developing friendships and relationships, we see the health of the community in those mutually beneficial relationships. Everybody benefits. It's not like this person is helping this person or, it's not a caregiver kind of thing. It's the natural supports that we all have in our lives that are so important. When we talk about affordable at Hope, we're saying that we want to create a community where someone who makes 60 to 80% of the area's median income could live. The workforce folks that take care of children or are teachers or are the direct support professionals, as Kenneth pointed out, that just don't make a lot of money but are so vital to our community. What would we do without them? So we want the rents to be affordable to anybody. And then we want a certain percentage of the units to be below 30% of the area median income. At least 25% of the units will be below 30%. And that's important, again, because we want people who don't have family that can help them rent an apartment to be able to afford it on that Social Security income. And we'll hear a lot about this from Micaela this morning, so I'm not going to go a lot into that. What we feel like makes Hope special, our concept, one that really will work and change people's lives, is that we want it to be a community of belonging. And that's, you'll hear this afternoon a lot from Eric about why belonging is so important for everyone and transformative. We know that, as I said earlier, and as we say often at Hope, that just giving someone an apartment in the community, doesn't make them feel that sense of belonging. So there's something extra that you have to provide. So the first step, as we see it, is the building. You start with the intentional design of the spaces to create places where people interact, to create common areas and spaces that people meet by chance and want to hang out, grab a cup of coffee and sit together, have interaction with the outside community come in to where you live, because the space you create is so beautiful that people want to come there. And that's why we're going to hear from Poe in just a little bit, why we're so excited about our developer. A second part is where it's located. It needs to be close to amenities, in a place that people can get out of where they live into the larger community, so close to transit, near amenities. Not everybody drives. A lot of people don't drive, and especially in a Hope community, we expect many older adults or people with disabilities might not have a car. Even, folks who are your teachers or your childcare providers, or whoever, that may not have a car. So we want it to be the spaces that begin to create the belonging. They belong in the community they live in and the larger community they're part of. The most important step to creating that belonging, though, is the people, right? It's about people. It's about how are we at Hope going to create a sense of belonging. We see that, again, as it starts from the space, and then it becomes more about the interactions. How do we get people in the Hope community to interact with each other, to want to interact with each other, and have those great supportive relationships? And for us, we see it happening through the naturally occurring connections, and then we will have also on-site staff that will create programming that will help people to interact. So whether that's a regular meal or time that's in the community space that we will hope to create, and whether that's programs or classes that are offered in the community that will be for the people that live there, and maybe also some for people that come from outside to join in. We will encourage what we call intentional neighboring, those relationships where if one resident might need help with something and another resident might be able to help with that. If someone has a hard time walking like I do, my neighbor might pull in my trash can for me, and I might in return respond by helping, with their college schoolwork, or providing a meal when they're sick and not feeling well. And that's the kind of intentional neighboring we want to create, those supports where people know each other and check on each other in a way. And again, you're going to hear a lot more from Eric about this afternoon, so I'll leave it there. So where are we now? This is the question most of you ask me, or Dottie or Ginny when you meet us for the first time, is how close are you to opening your doors, right? We are not there yet. We have made a lot of progress in the past year and are excited about all the potential that's happening. We are mostly, we can't answer the question of how long it will be to build a community until we have a piece of land. That's the first and foremost what we have to find. And that land has to be all those things I mentioned. It has to have the space to create those intentional spaces. It has to be close to amenities and walkable, and it's hard to find in this area, right? So that's our biggest challenge right now. And then once that happens, then our wonderful developers can talk more about timing in terms of, but we really hope within a few years, 3 years, at the most 5, to have our doors open and people living in the First Hope community in the Triangle. And our goal is not just to do one community, because we know the need is so great. We hope the collective impact work will help us create the model that can be an option across the state, and a model that's flexible enough to meet the needs of folks in rural communities, urban communities, wherever it might be. So that is our goal. We are not, one of the things that is so inspiring about Aura, Dottie, and Ginny is they had a problem that they saw for their own children, but they didn't set out to solve it just for them. They set out to solve it for a whole lot of people, for years and years and generations to come. And to me, that's pretty special, because they're pretty special people. But I want to introduce you to some other special people and stop talking now, because the big news that Hope had this year is that we, after meeting with many developers for over a long period of time, or Dottie and Ginny started long before even I joined them, we have had the blessing of creating a partnership with a developer, a national nonprofit developer called Preservation of Affordable Housing. And they are amazing. And I'm going to take a second to transition from my slideshow to theirs. And I'm going to invite John Springer, who is the senior project manager at POA, and Felicia Dawson, who is their, let's see if I can get it right, Director of Strategic Partnerships. Close enough? Community Partnerships. She's a director, and she's amazing. So they're going to come and share about POA in just a second.
Good morning. Good morning. Energy. This is my stall while she prepares.
So, let's see, is it going to go? Yeah, so just do that when or when you guys need it. Okay, thank you.
Hi, good morning. Can everybody hear me in the back? Great. Thank you so much for being here. We're really excited for this exciting partnership with Hope, and the speakers already this morning have been amazing. There's going to be so many more today. Felicia and I will just give a quick overview of our organization, Preservation of Affordable Housing, POA. It's kind of on the nose. It's what we do. And I'll start with a little overview and talk a little bit about some recent communities that we've worked with and how that might inform and influence our work here with Hope. So we are in 11 states and DC. We have developed and preserved 12,000 affordable homes that are permanently affordable. And so we're a mission-driven nonprofit, and we own, operate, and develop our affordable communities that are home to almost 19,000 individuals. They're places that people want to live, that stay for a long time. About just under half are age restricted for older adults, and that's HUD's definition. It's not me saying that that's older adults. But so there's a mix of family properties and older adult properties. And as folks get into their 7th and 8th decade, this is really allowing folks to live independently with the supports they need in community, and live vibrant and thrive and fulfilling lives. We also have a good number of folks that self-identify with disabilities, whether they're visible or invisible, and similarly are able to live independent, fulfilling lives with the supports that POA provides and coordinates. So I'll talk a little bit about some recent communities. These are in Massachusetts near Cape Cod. And these communities over the last couple of years have kind of intentionally brought in supports for folks with disabilities that, similar to what was discussed earlier this morning, really bringing care into the communities to allow integrated, intentional community living. And so that's Section 811, which is a HUD program which brings caregivers into the community for folks transitioning out of institutional settings, moving back into the community with the supports that they need. And so these are pictures of the buildings. They're really beautiful townhouses with very nice appliances, very sunny, light-filled, great places to live. A mix of incomes, a mix of ages, a mix of abilities. And as a housing developer, I get excited about these plans. They're kind of hard to understand, but basically what it means is it was a multi-phase project, and the first phase was for multifamily affordable apartments. The second phase was for older adults, and then the third phase that just finished last year was for affordable family housing and a mix of abilities, bringing in those supports. And it's really meant to be a thriving, integrated community with community spaces in the older adult building to bring activity there, a lot of volunteer opportunities, really active community, a playground, and really just a mix of folks that are able to thrive and able to stay in an area that, like Chapel Hill, is hard to find housing options without affordable housing. And then one other project that I'll talk about that is in the early stages and is in Maine is really focusing on universal design. So it's a 50-home building that's 100% accessible for folks with mobility issues. And so we're thinking about kitchens and baths that are barrier-free, thinking about adaptability for wheelchair users, thinking about wiring for voice-controlled kind of smart home features that allow folks to operate appliances and lights through voice. And so thinking about kind of pushing the envelope on accessibility and really gathering input from the community, from the end users, from the folks who will be living here, since kind of acknowledging, I have a different lived experience, I have blind spots, other people have different lived experiences. So really getting that input and doing work on the survey. And I think the text is probably too small, but it says, my bathroom has allowed me to maintain as much independence as I can, and it's great. And Felicia, can you tell me what the quote right above that says?
If I can do things for myself, that's incredible. That feels really good.
And so thinking about the Hope community and, what a really a beautiful, well-designed community looks like, these are some other communities that we're working on right now. in different areas that are around 50 to 60 homes, what it means to be really attractive. Kind of sometimes there's some stigma around affordable housing and what that means, and that it really can be well integrated in the community. It can be a place that people want to live, a community of choice with really beautiful homes. And so these are kind of some images that we're thinking about when we're thinking about what the Hope community can look like. And with that, it's great to talk about buildings and sticks and bricks and all that kind of thing, but it's really about the people. And so I think I'm going to hand it over to Felicia to talk about the kind of supports that POA thinks about when we think about community.
So, can you hear me? Yes. Okay, I don't like the mic. Yes, I will. But I don't like the mic sometimes seem impersonal, so I talk loud, so if I'm too loud, let me know. So I'll bring it down. So we do things a little differently. As a developer, that's in our name and our title and what we do, so we're a typical developer in that we have to find the resource to build the buildings. We have to do the business of designing the buildings and figuring out how do we make the designs match our pocketbooks. So we have to do that work. But we also recognize that the unit has to be more than just something for us to gain an asset, but it has to be something for the resident that lives in the property. And about 8 years ago, we started our community impact department that said, let's look at what's happening with the folks that live in the property. As we progressed, we realized that there's something else that happens around the properties that we're doing. So how do we talk about community and what community means to the buildings that we're doing, but what the building means to the community in itself? So how does that connection work? We have a formula for that: transparency, inclusivity, and consistency. We can't do this work, I think John knows this, we can't do this work as we sit through how do we make a deal happen, how do we build these beautiful buildings, if we don't think about what that looks like for the people that live in them. And oftentimes we discount that because we think they don't have the technical skills. Not everybody is an engineer, not everybody's an architect, but the value that they bring is how do we live in these environments and what will happen to the environments once we do something different with these physical buildings. So that concept is huge because that means we value the voice of the people, and that impacts what we build, why we're building it, and then how much it's going to cost us to build it, and then how do we find a rate of return for it. So in that, all of that stuff means we've got to provide some sexy stuff for people to want to stay in the units, right? If we want it to be an asset for them and us, what makes it sexy? A destination. So we've done a couple of things. We were the first nonprofit affordable housing developer to be able to manage a program called Family Self-Sufficiency. And you may see some of the numbers up there that where we help people in affordable housing realize the opportunity to grow. We also do a questionnaire every year with our families that live in the properties. What do you want to see? What really do you want to see? Let's talk about what really that looks like. Can we do it? Will it work? If we bring it, will you use it? How can you be a part of making sure that service works? And then we think about, particularly with our communities that are the smart and sexy, that is not seniors, they call themselves smart and sexy. We think about how are they aging in place intentionally? What does that look like? So a lot of our senior buildings and our staff and our community impact coordinators have relationships with assisted living facilities in the communities around. Because there's going to be a transition. And if you're intentional about thinking about those things as you move into our unit, that's something that makes it attractive for you to want to say, but it also allows us to address something that happens with families that are smart and sexy. So our formula of transparency is always telling people what is the process for development. We've heard about all the things we want to see in some of our buildings as we think about an inclusive community. What does that look like in terms of the bricks and sticks? How does that building get built? We demystify that for community. Everybody. It's okay to understand what the development process is, how much it costs us to build a building. You need to understand that in order to help us figure out what we're going to build. The second thing is there's a difference between input, inclusion, and engagement. They're not intertwined. They're very different concepts. They're very different approaches to the work. You need all three, but it's almost like this linear progression. You move from input, you move to inclusivity, and then you're engaged in your community and the process all along the way. So this is very important because we're not building something to you, we're building something with you and for you that will last a long time. And then being very consistent. We're going to keep coming back. We're going to show up, and we show up early. Our formula is really, when we do development, getting embedded in the neighborhoods early on. Even if we just have a concept, going to the monthly meetings, where people are coming together to talk about what they want to see, some of the challenges in the community, some of the assets that we won't know because we don't live there, but you do. And how do we absorb those assets or connect to those assets as we do the development? So that formula, it does cost a little bit more money sometimes in pre-development because we've got to come up with designs and have people look at them, and then may not like that. We've got to go back to the drawing board. It might impact our timeline a little bit, but that's okay. Because what you will build on the back end is a community that people want to be in, want to come to, and then want to tell everybody else about. And then as you think about your future, how do you expand it so it's not isolated to just one neighborhood, one off as we call it. But it's a thoughtful process to think about how do we replicate. And I think the final thing for us is that we recognize, as I said early on, the business of development is the business of development. But there's a triple bottom line that we always talk about. There's a rate of return on investment that we always want to get. We want to make sure we meet our numbers. We want to make sure the timeline happens so that we can generate the revenues that we like to see just as a developer. But there's also this return for the residents that live. And that tagline, we want the unit to be an asset not only for us, but for them. And then the final bottom line return is the community. There's something that's gonna happen to that neighborhood with this new structure. Whether it's been that old building that's been sitting there, had people in it, been dilapidated, we come in and revitalize it in a new way, it's going to do something to the neighborhood around. And then the people that live in the neighborhood somehow have always connected with their neighbors around them. But now there's an intentionality to reconnect in a way that uses that edifice as a connection for people to think about long-term and how their neighborhood or community grows. And oftentimes those three returns can generate revenue to get back to the first, because it ultimately, it's got to make sense numbers-wise as we make it make sense for people-wise. And it does cost a little bit of money, but there's an old adage, you need money to make money. But if you're needing money to make money, but then being rich in what you're giving back in return for a community, that is that triple bottom line. So we try to think about that, and the bricks and sticks of it is difficult a little bit, but we just take the time in our back office to walk through how the bricks and sticks connect to the fabric, which is the people that live in the property. Okay, I'm gonna give it back to you, John.
Thanks, Felicia. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because Laura did such a great job with an overview of the Hope vision and the Hope community. So are y'all ready for a quick real estate development 101 over the next 2.5 minutes? So I think everyone's kind of asking, why don't you just put shovels in the ground tomorrow? Why can't you just start right now? And so I'll just give a quick overview of the steps and kind of ways that people can be engaged along the way in the steps. So really the first, like Laura said, is finding some land, finding a building that is well connected to amenities, is the right size for the number of homes that we want to have in this vibrant community. And so we're actively looking right now, but if anybody knows of places, definitely let us know. And then the next step, once we have a piece of land, is permitting. And so what that means is if anybody's seen Parks and Rec, it's kind of like that. Sometimes I know there's city councilors, town councilors in the room. Everyone knows how exciting those meetings can be. And a lot of times, the folks that are the loudest aren't necessarily the folks that are directly impacted. So it's really important to show up to those meetings to support the kind of vision and the future community that you want to see. At the same time, kind of behind the scenes, POA and the development team is putting together the financing that makes these projects possible. And that diagram is actually looks like a joke, but that's really the structure for like a relatively simple project for affordable housing. So it's local funding, it's state funding, it's philanthropic money, dollars, putting all those pieces together to make these beautiful communities happen. And as that's happening, architects and engineers are working on the plans and the drawings, and here's where I think input is really, really important through the regular HOPE meetings, through the community meetings, to get the input of kind of what designs, what community spaces, what's important, what do folks want to see, so that it really is a community that reflects the interests and needs of folks who are going to be living there. And once all that's done, then you can start construction, and you put shovels in the ground, and that's always really exciting to see buildings go up, and it takes 12 to 14 months depending, and then once that's complete, everyone can move in, and then there's great opportunities for folks to be engaged through volunteer work, through activities on site, and so that's 2.5 minutes of real estate development. And so, kind of just to in close, I think in a Zoom call the other day, someone in the chat put the North Carolina state motto, which is to be rather than to seem. And so it's worth looking at the Zoom chat every now and then. There can be wisdom in there. And I think this really captures kind of, a way to live into our values through this community, to really, it's great we're going to talk today a lot about what the community should look like, but really at the end of the day, it's getting this community built that people can live in, and we're excited to see this through with all of your input and support. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. I'm Aura. I am one of the co-founders and board president of HOPE, which, if anyone's curious, stands for Housing Options for People with Exceptionalities. It is my honor to introduce Micaela Connery, our keynote speaker. When Dottie, Ginny, and I initially started HOPE, one of the very first things that we did was to look at all of the communities that existed across the United States to get some guidance and understand what they are going through. And I have to say, and Dottie repeats this a lot, the Kelsey is our guiding star, our North Star. We consistently would go back to the Kelsey to look at how they did things. They are creating affordable housing in San Francisco area, which says a lot. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Micaela, who is the CEO of the Kelsey and the co-founder. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very tall, but hopefully you can still pick me up on this microphone. My name is Micaela Connery. I'm really grateful to be here and excited to be here and appreciate the work that HOPE's doing and the engagement with the Kelsey and with our team on this. As Aura said, I am the CEO, but I am also the co-founder of the Kelsey. And this is my co-founder. Her name is Kelsey. She was my cousin. She lived with multiple significant disabilities. And my pretty much entire life, we were born 3 months apart and really went through every single life milestone together. And so I cannot overstate how much Kelsey's view on the world and Kelsey's experience in the world and Kelsey's impact on my own life impacted how I see and understand the world and how I see and understand experience of disability. And from a really young age, it was remarkable that Kelsey made it super clear that she was not broken, but the world was broken, and that the world really didn't accommodate her needs. The world wasn't built with her in mind, and throughout her life, whether that was fighting to be in an inclusive school or being a member of her church and going through her confirmation class with everyone else or having an inclusive summer camp experience, Kelsey's life was just driven through inclusion, and she brought communities along with her through that process. And because of Kelsey, when I was 15 years old, I founded a not-for-profit called Unified Theater. We were a group of students with and without disabilities who created and performed and produced our own theater productions in our schools. That program grew to over 100 schools across the country, including East Chapel Hill at a time. So I don't know if any of your students involved in that, but we launched back in 2002 and ran that through high school and college, and after college, while running it full time, I did that for about 5 years before transitioning it on, I had this really sad realization. It was around the same time that Kelsey was going through her own challenge, and I know this is a group of people familiar with this need, but Kelsey and I were both in our early 20s. We were both cellar dwellers, and we were both not happy about living in our parents' home. I was, a young 20-something, barely making money working for a nonprofit. I was ready to move out. Kelsey was, same age. Both her sisters, including younger, had moved from home, and she was ready to go. It took me 6 months to figure out how to find community housing, and it took Kelsey over 6 years until ultimately she was able to find a group home to live in. And that actually wasn't the vision that she or her family necessarily had for her. It was a wonderful place, but they did have this grander vision of a truly integrated, inclusive community. That wasn't something she found. She found a great home with wonderful roommates that she lived through the rest of her life. But I was really personally experiencing this gap in what was options for young adults with and without disabilities around community housing. And at the exact same time, we were reaching the age where most of our alumni at Unified Theater, students with and without disabilities, were becoming adults in the world. And I felt this sort of robbery that we were making this promise of an inclusive adulthood that was never realized. We were telling young people with disabilities and without disabilities, be a part of these inclusive school programs through the arts, and it'll prepare you for this inclusive adulthood that exists. Oh, just kidding, that inclusive adulthood does not exist. And that was just so stark. I remember being invited by parents of young adults who were talking about the lack of options for their children. And I also remember my peers without disabilities saying, it's like when I graduated high school, disabled people evaporated. It's like, and that is, I think we talk a lot, and we need to think about this as allies in this space of, we talk a lot about inclusion, and then all of a sudden, folks with disabilities are pushed out of sight, out of mind, because our environments, our housing, our jobs, the places we spend our daily lives are not integrated and inclusive, and those individuals are no longer visible. And so that really started the Kelsey and what our goal was to be as an organization. And I'll share our timeline of how I'm just gonna use this so I can actually see my, that really started the Kelsey and our work and what we aim to do. I think I just skipped a slide, sorry.
That happened to me.
Okay.
I know what you mean.
I'll just keep talking, and then slides will catch up. Similar to what Aura and the Hope community described, I really started with first saying, what's the problem? And I went to graduate school, focused entirely on how to figure out housing for people with disabilities. And I did really 3 things around this work. I first explored existing projects, of which there were minimal to no projects available. Do you mind if I just keep talking?
No.
Doing that? Okay. I first explored existing projects, of which there were little to no projects out there. There were some interesting one-off disability-specific or segregated communities, however you want to define them, models that were existing around the country. There were some actually still operating institutions that were our state-run institutions that still operate in several states across this country. I actually visited those and spent time in those. I spent time in different sort of intentional co-housing communities, L'Arche, Camp Hill, some of these more nonprofit-founded, connected communities with different themes to them. Also spent a lot of time at disability service agencies who were doing mixed sites and services models, whether they had a mix of group homes and apartment options and other in-home service providers. So I really landscaped the field and tried to see, what's happening, what's out there. The next thing I did is talk to disabled people. I don't currently live with a disability, and I felt like that was, and we'll continue to talk through that. The second thing I did was a set of human-centered design focus groups to really, and that's still a part of the Kelsey's work today, to really ask people with disabilities what they wanted out of their housing, as well as caretakers and family members. And then the third thing was actually doing a landscape of related fields, looking at what already exists out there around senior housing, around homelessness, homelessness,
place.
around
Can't figure out.
intergenerational communities, around mainstream affordable housing. How can we, veterans housing, how can we kind of learn from these related fields, many of whom, thank you, have had much more success than disability forward housing, and how can we learn from that and borrow that? And that really defined what the Kelsey, thank you, what the Kelsey aims to do here, which is our mission to both serve and really key here, and I hear a lot of discussion around intellectual and developmental disabilities. The Kelsey does serve, and Kelsey lived with intellectual and developmental disabilities, but we are a cross-disability organization. We serve people with all types of disabilities, and we'll come to why we really embed that in our mission and in our advocacy work. We do it with, now I can't see them on the screen. We operate both to create new models of housing and then think about policy change that can scale and systemic change that can scale to take single communities and bring them to life everywhere. And we do that in a way of being co-led of people with and without disabilities. 50% of the Kelsey staff are people with disabilities, as well as a third of our board and tons of our community consultants and advocates. That's really critical that from the beginning, middle, and end of our process, we are a co-led organization, led in allyship among people with and without disabilities. And here's just some of our values that we think about here at the Kelsey. So I'm going to start with a quick overview of sort of our housing projects and actually what we've built and created at the Kelsey and on what timeline, and continue through to what a vision for a disability forward housing future can and should look like. So the Kelsey really thinks about our work through three lenses: affordable, accessible, and inclusive. For us, we define inclusive as our guiding principle and our founding story of why we exist at all. And we, inclusive is not a feeling. Inclusive is not just something that is like being nice to people with disabilities, which has been sort of, used sometimes. Inclusive is actually communities that are integrated of people with and without disabilities, where there is also a sense of belonging where folks are brought together. So it's inclusive is both being in spaces together and actually the experience in those spaces being shared. And we really look at this, and sorry, the formatting is a little off because I switched from my Mac to this PC, but so, where we started was segregated housing. That's like our institutions, our group homes, people in hospitals, people living on the streets. We're a little making progress around integrated housing. That's like people physically being in the same space together. But really where we're trying to go is this concept of inclusive housing, where people are truly a part of a shared community. The other big difference, does anyone see the difference in number 2 and number 3 besides where the dots are located? The color, the difference in the dots. So inclusive also really means that you recognize disability as a unique individual experience, and you don't just lump everybody into the same category and assume that they want the same experience. And so inclusivity really recognizes that cross-disability nature. It recognizes difference in preference. It really looks at the individualized experience that we all desire, and mixes that into a housing model, and recognizing not people as just a clump of a population, but as individuals who may have that shared identity of disability, but have different experiences and preference when it comes to their own housing. And this is really our guiding light that we think about in all the work we do. But as an organization focused on scale, we think a lot about how we both honor the individual, but create solutions that are replicable and scalable to take across communities and to take everywhere. So it's that constant back and forth of focusing on the individual while thinking about the system and the scalable strategies. Our second piece is affordable. I was shocked when I traveled around and looked at existing models of housing that places with $2,500, $3,600, $5,000 a month in rent. I couldn't afford that. And the majority of people with disabilities cannot either. People with disabilities are 4 times more likely to live in poverty. There's not a single US metro market that a person with disabilities on SSI can afford to live. Laura brought the great stat across the country. That would be 127% of an entire SSI check. So somebody's whole income and then some is what the average rent in the US is for a basic apartment. So if we are not anchoring on affordability, we are leaving out a significant portion of the population of people with disabilities. However, the Kelsey, and we'll share in a moment, really focuses on mixed income communities, recognizing the diversity of income needs and recognizing the diversity of affordability needs. So our communities range from people who are extremely low income, relying on SSI, all the way up to what's defined as workforce housing or market rate housing for people who are making $95,000 a year. So really mixed affordability. And then we also focus on accessibility, and that's really about designing the spaces and where buildings are located, and we'll come back to our design standards on this, of the built environment and how that supports cross-disability accessibility. And then accessibility, we learned very early on in our focus groups that accessibility is not about meeting code. That is one tiny element of accessibility. But accessibility really starts from where you build a community, and it continues all the way through to how that community is operated. And then accessibility isn't just the width of your door frames or the height of your ramps and things like that. Those are key parts of accessibility. But accessibility is also things like, what is the signage used in your building and how do people find their way around? What is the leasing? Do we have a plain language lease? So we're creating these at the Kelsey right now. So people actually have the cognitive access to know what the heck they're signing when they sign into housing. Accessibility looks like the spaces within the building for community services and staff members and community programs and events, and how the built environment facilitates community. Accessibility looks like how many feet your site is from transit and other amenities and where it's located with access to those services. So we really take a holistic view of accessibility and bring that through. And so this really builds onto our theory of change at the Kelsey, which is a really explicit approach of we need to both build communities and change systems. We need to create housing on the ground that meets immediate housing needs, demonstrates what works, pioneers forward new models of integrated and inclusive housing, and we need to couple that directly with systems change that both is informed by that work and scales the work that does into other communities. And so we do this feedback loop all the time at the Kelsey, where, as we're developing these housing, we go, 811's literally the only game in town for disability forward funding for housing. How do we go back and get increased public subsidy for these kind of housings that not just the Kelsey would benefit from, but cities and projects and states across the country would benefit from? So we do QAP advocacy, or we, working on new HUD subsidy and new HUD programs to get more dollars out for people with disabilities. We did this as we were developing our housing. We were training, we went from project 1 to project 2 that I'll share on in a second, and we had to retrain our whole design and construction and development team on what truly cross-disability, holistic accessibility looked like. And we said, we shouldn't do this every time. There should be a really clear set of standards that we can take to bring folks along and say, build this is what we want. And so we created the design standards for housing accessibility and inclusion that we're using in our projects, but are being used by projects across the country. And so we constantly do that of how do we build what works and how do we scale what works to ultimately create more housing opportunities for people with disabilities. And that all that sits on the balance of disability forward field building and being co-led by people with and without disabilities. And so here's a bit on our timeline, because I know that's interesting to folks here to think about where we went. The gray areas, I was in graduate school, that's when I first started kind of thinking about and researching housing. In 2017, I moved to the Bay Area. I'm from Rhode Island, so I knew not a soul there, but I thought two things about San Francisco and the Bay Area. One is there's a real history of inclusivity and disability rights there that has been essentially erased because disabled people can no longer afford to live there, along with many other elements of diversity. And that if you could solve the affordable housing challenge for people with disabilities in San Francisco, you could maybe solve it anywhere. And so I moved with $0 and 0 friends to San Francisco. We started applying for funding in the beginning of 2018. We got our first round of funding in March of 2018 from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. They were our seed funder. We spent about 10 months doing community organizing, a process that we actually have documented and structured called our Together We Can Do More process. And that was a really intentional community organizing and field building effort where we brought together across 3 regional teams, San Francisco, South Bay and Peninsula, and East Bay. Those are kind of our 3 regions in the Bay Area. We had 3 teams in those areas of housing developers, disabled advocates, family members, service providers, and policymakers and funders, who each of those teams worked through a process with us of defining the problem, planning the solutions, scoping the interventions, and committing to next steps. So we really structured those groups as what would it look like to build disability forward housing together. And in all 3 of those regions now we have different projects. So in San Jose we have a community, $75 million community under construction that will open in beginning of 2024. Our San Francisco community just closed our final public funding and will break ground in the beginning of next year. And then we also have an inclusive partner property in Oakland. And that where we're looking at next year is that we've also, as we've been building those communities, leading lots of advocacy and also doing quite a bit of technical assistance to support other people on their own disability inclusive housing projects, whether that's universities building residential programs on campus or disability service organizations trying to build housing for the individuals that they serve, or family groups trying to start new housing projects where they live. And so we will continue to do that, as well as going into new markets where we're developing these kind of housing. This is our team at the Kelsey, and pictured in the middle is Kelsey's mom and dad. So they are still celebrating their daughter's incredible legacy. Kelsey passed away 2 weeks after we got our first round of funding at the Kelsey. And so this was not meant to be a legacy organization, but is very much, which is really powerful and really remarkable. And I'd also say how much I've learned. I take it really seriously. It means a lot to be a leader of a disability-focused organization who doesn't currently live with a disability. And we should question that. We should question that very seriously, of what it means to have a field focused on an issue that is predominantly led by people who don't have that lived experience. And so I'm constantly learning in my own journey of what it means to be an allied leader, what long-term staffing and succession looks like at the Kelsey, and how we really build a field that is with disabled people at the center of leadership. And we have that on our team now, and we'll continue to grow that and evolve that. So here's our housing pipeline. These are our projects. Like I said, we have mixed income inclusive communities in San Jose and San Francisco. Both of these communities, going back to POA's great presentation on Affordable Housing 101, both of these are low-income housing tax credit funded projects, meaning that they are publicly subsidized and include a mix of local and state housing subsidy, as well as federal HUD 811 project-based vouchers. Those are vouchers that our residents have. They are a mix of people who are paying less than, if they have a voucher, they're paying like around $200 a month, but on our lowest end, our rents are around $490 a month. Our highest rents are up to about $2,200 a month, so a big range, but still deeply affordable. And each of those communities has different design features, and that's really critical for us. That the Kelsey Air Station is in a single family neighborhood just north of downtown San Jose. It's literally next to it are all little houses. You can imagine that was quite a process to get it approved. And so even the design of the building, the amenities of it are reflective of our disability forward focus and that inclusive, accessible design, and also what's contextually relevant and appropriate for that neighborhood. San Francisco is quite different. This site is literally next to City Hall in the center of San Francisco, in a very active civic neighborhood across from the Symphony and the Ballet. And so that looks different and has different amenities and had a different community outreach process too, because the neighbors are different. And then our inclusive partner properties, these are projects that we don't directly build at the Kelsey, but we tag onto, and whether that's with an affordable developer or market rate developer, adding on the disability inclusion and our resident services to support residents once they're in there. And I'll come to the resident services in a moment. Okay, back on. Okay, so our design and our principles of our buildings, and these are reflected in our housing design standards a bit. I did bring some handouts on the Kelsey, so if you're interested, they're outside. And one of them is a description of, I can't carry them with me because they're big, but a description of our housing design standards, which are these elements that define a lot of these community features that we've brought into our buildings. So the first thing is a connected community. Spot on with Hope that housing is not about just getting someone's head in bed. It's really about creating the community around it. And that starts with how you engage the community through your outreach process. It's also how you design the building for spaces for community. And then it has a ton to do with how you lease and market, and the work that Felicia talked about with actually the resident services and how that community is created once people get in. We look at the diversity of our residents and really think about whether you are a teacher or a person with intellectual developmental disabilities moving out for the first time, or an older adult, or a person who's been living in their car. How do we build a unique housing model that is able to respond to diverse resident needs? And that looks like, again, that mix of individualization and adaptability in both units and resident services, but sort of a universal, all can belong here in that mixed tenant base that has access to the housing. We have to intentionally program for inclusion, and so our operating expenses include a budget. So we do not fundraise year after year for continuing to run inclusive programming. That was something right off the bat we were not interested in. It's a big enough lift to get these started. We don't want to have to sustain them through the goodwill of flawed philanthropy. So we actually need to have inclusion built into the operating expenses of the building and have a budget for that inclusive programming on an ongoing basis. We work on the cross-disability accessible design, and that is everything from including a sensory garden that's about, multi-sensory experience to, again, mobility accessible units to wayfinding to how the actual resident experience is designed for cognitive access or for health and wellness. To the materials that we use and what we build into the space around chemical sensitivities, which has double bottom line on our sustainability goals as well. And this is our San Francisco community. That's the one that will break ground in the beginning of the year, again, right there in San Francisco, that's City Hall. One of the key things that we heard from our focus group, so I would say there were kind of 3 key themes that we heard from people with disabilities, as well as family members, but particularly people with disabilities on what they wanted in their housing. One was the flow between the private, shared, and public spaces, that folks didn't want to always be a part of community, but they didn't want to always be alone either. That's pretty natural. That sometimes we heard from folks that they were overemphasized on community, that it was like, you're hanging out with people all the time, and you're like, hey, I just want to watch Netflix and not talk to anybody. And so that's okay. And then other times there was the option to engage in community. The second key thing we heard from folks is that decoupling of housing and services, yet coordination between the two, which I'll come to more in a second. And then the third theme was access to green spaces. It was really interesting. The others were very much, things we sort of thought about already, but this one was a real, nothing about disability specific, but just over and over again, people said access to outdoor spaces was really critical. So both of our communities include both their own outdoor amenity spaces on site, as well as in locations where folks have access to outdoor amenities nearby. And then thinking about amenitizing inclusion and how do you really take what you focused on from a disability access and inclusion, but that those are in fact amenities for all people. So I go back to the plain language leasing that, we would all benefit from a plain language lease. We would all really like that. And so we think a lot about what did we focus on from a disability forward, accessible, inclusive design that is actually just an amenity for everyone that we would all like. And I use the word disability forward a lot. That is in our mission at the Kelsey. It's a word that we sort of made up, I guess. And that really is this idea that we anchor on the needs of the most and multiply marginalized, and that doing so, and in our case, that's people with disabilities, and then particularly people with disabilities who are low income and people with disabilities from communities of color, and that actually anchoring on those access needs just creates a better experience for everybody. And we hear that and see that over and over and over again as we design and conceive these spaces and as we talk to our communities. So I want to spend a little bit of time, because all of this really hinges on what happens once the community is actually operational, and that we, the Kelsey, we often define our model as source, seed, scale, and serve. So we source deals to be disability forward projects and help them get off the ground. We seed projects with capital that we raise from public and private and philanthropic partners. We scale those through policies and systems change, and that our work really comes together in our inclusion concierge program and our resident services. So in our example of, our San Francisco community, we're working with Mercy Housing. They're our co-developer. They are doing the traditional property management part of the site and the leasing and the compliance, but we, the Kelsey, run the inclusion concierge program, which was a key part of our model from the beginning in our resident services program. And so our resident services program is really rooted on these 3 concepts of centering on the individual and the resident, thinking about a team-based approach of how is the resident services delivered in the context of the broader property team and also the broader services infrastructure in the community around that individual, and how do we anchor that in social connectedness and natural supports that I am struck by. We often talk about creating independent housing, but I think we try to apply principles of disability justice into our work, and one of the principles of disability justice is interdependence. So we are not actually trying to create independent housing, we are trying to create interdependent housing, and that social connectedness is a really critical part of it. The Kelsey looks at something, and this is available on our Learn Center at thekelsey.org/learn, of our triangle of community living. And this really came out of that second part, everything on our work really came out of what we heard from folks of what they wanted, and then went back and said, how do we actually do this? And so what we heard from folks over and over again was decouple my housing and services. I don't want to have the same provider as I do service. I don't want to have the same provider as I do landlord. It really gets people stuck. You can imagine that. You want to, many of us move our housing, but we keep our doctors, or we keep our therapists, or we keep our whoever the people are around our infrastructure, regardless of whether we've moved our housing. And vice versa. We might stay in our housing and hire and fire people who come into our lives. And so we don't want to unnecessarily bundle those for folks with disabilities. That is what institutions were and are. And so decoupling that housing and services was so critical for choice and autonomy and self-direction for individuals. But what we heard from people is that they wanted those housing and services to understand one another and to know one another. And so we think a lot about housing-related services, of how do we, on the housing development side, how do we make sure that we are building housing understanding folks' services needs? And that looks like everything from, we have spaces within both of the Kelsey communities for hoteling service provider staff, so that we ourselves are not an in-home, our services end at the door of the unit and the door of the building. We are not an in-home provider, but we have spaces in our building for in-home providers to come in and have awake overnight staff and little phone booths throughout the building, or have meeting spaces where staff can meet with, residents can meet with service providers who are serving them, or have case meetings with their individual support teams or whatever it is, and building those spaces into the building, even though we ourselves are not the provider. The second thing is the inclusion concierge program. So we've built a staff member, 2 full-time staff members for the scale of our communities, funded through the building operating expenses. They are funded and permanent within the building. And those individuals' job, as a concierge suggests, is to connect and support people to access the services that they need. So they both connect people to service providers and support staff. They help people when they need to change services, because that's also quite difficult for folks, especially who don't have family support. When we say people have choice about services, but they don't even know what's out there or how to actually make those choices. And so that facilitation of our inclusion concierge doing that. They create connections between the residents, of building that interdependent community, knowing who are both San Francisco Giants fans and who can, go to a game together, who likes yoga, or who can join each other for church on Sunday or synagogue. So those kind of relationships that our inclusion concierge really intentionally build. And then also referring out to other services and programs in the community, even outside of disability-specific programs. And we say the triangle of community living because we think it's really essential to always frame our work that our housing and our services are really a means to an end. These are baselines that need to be secured in order for us to live the community lives that we all desire. And that's true for people with and without disabilities. And so we really need to think of both of those, delivering both of those things. The Kelsey really delivering on the housing side with our connection to services through our inclusion concierge. We really don't touch this bottom, the services and support. That's not us. But that as we do the housing and do our services, our resident services with our housing, we're linking that out to these broader goals for community life. And all of this work, we connect really closely to field building and advocacy. So my biggest thing that I saw from the start of launching the Kelsey and looking at what existed out there was that there were some interesting one-off models, but we did not have a unified field. We did not have strong policies or even policy makers who were having, this issue on their agenda. And that while it was really nice, we are really proud that in less than 4 years, we've secured, 230 plus homes and $170 million in funding. It's like something really amazing to celebrate, and that is a friggin' drop in the bucket. And so if we are not actually connecting that work to field building and advocacy and how to move this field forward, we are really, failing the larger issue. And so our theory of change is deeply rooted in these areas. And that includes, and I've got kind of a one-pager on some of this, and some of this is stuff that Hope has used actually, is, our work around field building and advocacy looks at both on the field building side of both open sourcing resources and just sharing what works. And we encourage folks to take our ideas and spread them and use them and copy them and do whatever. And we've got a lot of open source resources, from our design standards to specific guides on how to host inclusive community workshops to kind of everything in between, that we open source. We do capacity building, where we support organizations through technical assistance to actually help them, figure out their financing model or do a feasibility study or build their resident services program and actually figure out their own interventions around inclusive housing. And then we also do co-development. So like I'm going straight from here to Birmingham, Alabama, where we're supporting a team there to start in the earliest stages of building a disability-forward housing community in that city that we would co-develop and support the folks on the ground to get done. And so deeply committed to not being a first of a kind, or not being a single of a kind, but being the first of many, that we're able to support a lot of other people doing this work. And reduce resources and consolidate capacity and expertise so that we're not constantly reinventing the wheel as a field. And so these are some of the highlights over the last 4 years that we're deeply proud of and have been able to count among our work. And so I want to close with, what does this all mean in terms of a big picture, and what can we in this room, whether you're thinking about local solutions where you are or feeding them up to national advocacy or national field building, what does a disability forward housing future look like, and what will it take each of us to develop that? And I think there's just a few key things that define what that future will be. That future will be co-led by people with and without disabilities. If you are leading disability forward housing and there are not paid disabled folks at the table who are part of defining that work, and there are not folks with disabilities who are trusted advisors and powerful partners, not just tokenistic check the box partners, but powerful partners in shaping that work, it won't happen. And I am incredibly proud to witness, I would say, over the last 5-10 years, we have seen incredible, especially at the federal policy level, incredible growth and power of disabled advocates who are moving the needle on significant policy issues. And where we are failing is that actually parent and family member advocacy often goes directly against self-advocates. And it is a remarkable thing to me to think about that if we had a strong, aligned coalition of disabled people and family members and allies, we would be the largest and most powerful political movement out there. If we all spoke and sang from the same song sheet about what was needed for disability forward housing, for in-home supportive services, for HUD interventions, for Medicaid interventions, for these policies, if we shared a policy agenda that was joined with these leading self-advocate organizations, we would be unstoppable. That has not happened. We have not had a unified field in that way. In fact, there's many times where in both directions, bills are killed because we can't agree internally on what's needed. I think that is, the future will be made by us rejecting that and us finding the real, we are talking about the same things. We are talking about affordability. We are talking about access to direct support professionals. We are talking about increased funding for these issues. We are asking for the same things, and we need to be asking for it together. And we, as people who may be family members or currently live without disabilities, I think the onus goes on us to really, think about where we put our political energy and how we're aligning that and really taking the lead from self-advocate driven work and tacking on to that, not actually coming out and fighting and expecting folks to come sort of and figure out the alternative. So I think there's an incredible amount of responsibility, and I say it knowing there's a lot of, I saw earlier, there's a lot of family members here, that I think we need to think hard and fast when we do things like fight the HCBS settings rule. I think we need to think hard and fast. When we do something like that, we are playing right into the hands of policymakers who don't want to fund HCBS. So they say, great, you guys can't figure out amongst yourself what you want us to do with these kind of funding. Why would we give more funding to the program? So we really need to build power in our shared movement and our shared agenda as disabled people and allies and family members of disabled people to move these agenda forward. It is possible. It is our choice to not do it, and we haven't been doing it well. I think the next thing would be to have capital to support innovation and impact. So our field has been deeply under-resourced, whether that be around public funding and a lack of subsidy. As I said, there's really kind of one quite small program that's really specific to housing for people with disabilities. We have not seen sort of the level of impact investing or program-related investing of kind of concessionary capital, as well as philanthropic dollars into this space. And so the Kelsey is in the process by 2025 of really looking to build a large $50 million fund to be able to see different projects like this across the country, so that we have the capital to get projects off the ground, so that we cannot be banging our heads against walls on a local level over and over again, but that we have scaled and universal capital coming from both federal and state government, as well as from private investment, that that we can then take forward and build these projects and realize those vision together. And that my favorite board, I don't have a favorite board member. My favorite thing a board member once said was, although I do, I just won't tell them. This isn't the one. They're not my favorite. But my favorite thing a board member said is, he said, he's a real estate developer, and he said, I'm a service provider to capital. And I think, and another thing in a real estate class I took, he who has the gold makes the rules. And so if we have the capital that sort of defines what kinds of housing gets built, shocking, that kind of housing gets built. Whether we like it or not, capitalism is not a principle of disability justice. This is in fact the opposite of disability justice, but we live in a capitalist world, and so we need this capital to move our projects forward and to be able to see real impact. The other is really having clear standards and best practices that we understand throughout across the industry and that we're all applying together. And so that was work like we did with the housing design standards and trying to create, a set of guidelines so that we weren't constantly recreating the wheel on what accessible inclusive design was. It also looks like having clear language. So, when I went deep on what affordability is and what inclusion is, we need to no longer sort of use these words as euphemisms, but use these words with clarity of what they actually mean on implementation. Because if we are going and saying, going back to some of our advocacy work, if we are going and saying, our children really need affordable housing, and let me show you this community that I've created that costs $3,500 a month. It's like, what? Like, we need to be really clear that's not affordable. So that's fine. We should just be clear that that is maybe a disability community, but it's not an affordable disability community. And we need to just have transparency and clarity about what it is we're building, who we're trying to serve, what we're not achieving, what we haven't done, and what the shortcomings are, and have that clarity and transparency so that we can understand what this field is actually pushing forward and understand where the gaps are that need to be filled in through policy, through capital, and through new models. We need to really continue to lean into this decoupling of housing and services. There is really infusing the two together. Not only is it not what disabled advocates have fought since 1999 to do, to have these choices be made independently, it muddies the water and it confuses the interventions, because actually the agencies on both the state and federal level who are thinking about services and thinking about housing are two totally different worlds. They are not part of each other, and so we need to have a lot of clarity. They can be, again, coordinated and understanding one another, but they are not the same. I would not go to the Department of Housing and Community Development in North Carolina to talk to them about how when I build housing, I'm worried that my residents won't have services. I need to go to the state Medicaid and talk about that. And so we really need to be specific about that. We need parallel interventions around robust supportive services and robust housing options and housing policies. And those things need to be service ready and service linked. As we build housing, we need to be ready for people who need those services in them. We need to be linked to the service systems that our residents will someday use, but we need not, combine them all together. We need to be super clear that those are two different paths. The Kelsey is a housing organization that builds in systems to think about services and connect to services. We are not a service provider, and that's okay. And simultaneously, we're working to bolster and think about, and some of our parallel policies of, we got to build up that service infrastructure. That's its own problem and its own challenge, and we can do those two things quite distinctly, yet thoughtfully connected and coordinated. And we need supportive policies and systems. Ultimately, the government is going to be the payer at scale for this. So we use a lot of frameworks around thinking of doers and payers, who does the work, who pays for the work at scale. And we really, ultimately, if we think about the scale of this problem, the deep affordability needs of the community of people with disabilities, we cannot do it without government as payer at scale. And so if we are not thinking about bringing government along and constantly bringing our interventions to policymakers to talk to them about what they need to do to scale this up and bring it to other places, we are not going to actually have a measurable change on this for the long term. And we need a unified and coordinated field. So this comes back full circle that we really could have incredible power as a field of disabled people, of housing providers, of family members, of service providers, if we all shared a coordinated agenda for what a disability forward housing future works, if we all got behind a shared policy platform, I have no doubt that we could achieve it and bring it forward. And we just haven't had that coordination in our field. We've had one-off models, we've had kind of ridiculous infighting about what the right kind of housing is, and we've really, lost sight of the prize, which is large, scaled social impact around these issues that we all understand, and actually we all want the same thing in the end, and we need to just let all that other stuff besides and know what our final true north is, which is these, abundant housing options for people with disabilities to live in the community of their choice with the services that they need to thrive. And that's what we're talking about, and we can all get behind the interventions that would make that possible and be a coordinated field around that and share our resources so that we are not constantly recreating capacity, but sharing capacity and frankly doing more with less, which is going to be required on all of that. As I close out, I do just want to quickly take a moment to pause and acknowledge that we lost a pioneer in our field last week. Lois Curtis is the reason we exist. It's the reason we are even able to have this conversation. Lois Curtis was a woman from Georgia with intellectual disabilities, a black woman who lived in an institution and didn't want to anymore, and brought a case all the way to the Supreme Court, Olmstead versus LC, to mandate the right to community living. And we truly stand on her shoulders as a field. We think about her all the time, talk about a co-led movement. This disabled woman led this movement. She started it off. She is why we exist. And so I just wanted to pause and acknowledge her tremendous impact on the work that we do and the work that all of you do, and the legacy that she leaves. She died way too young as an advocate. She had much more art and much more advocacy to do, but we are continuing to honor her work and the impact that she's made. So thank you for that. I think I have like 5 minutes because I got through it quicker than I thought. So Laura, do you want to just jump into the panel, or do you want me to do a couple of questions?
We're going to have a break after you, so we could do a few questions.
Okay, perfect. I can do a few questions. So thanks.
What?
And we do have these outside as if you're interested in knowing more on the Kelsey and some of our work. And I will tell you that our comms person will be very sad because this wasn't in our beautiful Kelsey brand. So these are in our beautiful Kelsey brand. So you can check those out outside. Any questions? Nope. Questions? Yeah.
You mentioned the research that you've done, and I haven't checked out your website, but do you have a report or a quote to share some great research on?
Yeah, so all of it's available online at thekelsey.org/learn. What's up there is our most recent research is with the Urban Institute, and that launches a larger agenda around research around particularly housing and disability and the intersection of that. But the first fact sheet is up on thekelsey.org/learn right now, and everything else is downloadable from there. We don't have generally like a large I published that's also available there. I published a white paper that's through the Harvard Kennedy, the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard on disability housing in the field. That's also up there. That was back in 2018, so that's a few years old now. But there's, all that research is there. We don't have like one long research piece. We kind of have it in chunks around the different areas. I will say on our newest research though, just to your stat earlier, because we really want to get on that number of this aging caregiver number. Mm-hmm. So what the American Community Survey, which was our data source for that, what they came up with is out of that data, we could find that there are 7 million adults with disabilities who live in a household where they are not head of household, meaning that they are living with a family member. And of those 7 million adults, 52% of them, that head of household is 55 years or older. Wow. So that's like our most recent data that really starts to show okay, that's 3.5 million people who are really have a short-term housing need, and another 3.5 million people who have a medium to long-term housing need. And not to mention all the other folks. Go ahead.
Thank you. I want to just commend you, as you were talking about the future, the number one thing was co-led by people with and without disabilities. And you were talking about, some of the challenges that came from the parents and families. Could you speak a little bit more about, why that is and where's the disconnect?
Yeah. Can you repeat her? Yeah, I'll repeat the question. So the question was about a future co-led by people with and without disabilities, and that some of the challenges come from parents and families, and why is there that disconnect? I think it's a couple things. I think the first is that I do give parents and family credit, and my own family went through this, like, we didn't have the visibility into any other option besides segregated or disability-specific housing, especially if your child, so I come from a background of Kelsey lived with significant support needs. She used 24-hour care, and I also was a direct support professional for people with really significant support needs who lived with autism, for autistic individuals. And so my lens is actually around significant support needs. However, I think a lot of parents ineffectively see that self-advocates who are, a lot of the folks who are leading as people with disabilities, you know, maybe have not as many support needs visibly, you actually don't know, but that a lot of parents say, oh, that self-advocate, they don't represent my kid's needs, like they aren't like my, you know, my kid isn't like them. Yeah, no kidding, and that self-advocate isn't claiming that. And actually that self-advocate in many cases, like the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, they are the fiercest fighters for increased funding for home and community-based services, which is exactly what people with high support needs need. And so even if visibly that person doesn't look like your child, they actually are advocating for your child's needs at profound and significant levels. And so I think it's both that. We haven't been given the view of what integrated inclusive housing looks like for people with disabilities, especially those with higher support needs. And we actually have a disconnect between the individual and how they present their disability to actually the issue that individual is fighting for and carrying forward. And actually that underlying issue that self-advocacy group or whomever is carrying forward is exactly what these parents are saying they need and want. And so I think there's that sort of double disconnect. And I think the last thing is, and I don't have a solution for that, and I honor and, you know, think a lot about the role of parents and family caregivers in this space, because the reality is that a lot of this effort has fallen on the shoulders of parents, that for so long parents have been unsupported and they have just been required to figure out the individualized experience of their child and what they can get for them. And I think that is both remarkable and admirable and unacceptable. And so we need to, and so it's a really hard tension, because you bring parents into this advocacy space and they say, I know my child best and I've been fighting for this for years, and they have. But we also need to say that if we rely on parent advocates to move this field forward, one, it's just inequitable for the families who are existing around it. We don't require other people to solve their social problems themselves. We have many public systems who do that, so it's inequitable for the parents doing it. It's also inequitable for the people who don't have family members who are a part of that advocacy work, or who don't have, you know, living parents or parents with the resources to show up and do those spaces. So I think there's you know, a lot of personalization there, which is so rightfully so. I don't have children yet, but I can imagine that this is your child, and so it's such a hard thing to think about how to talk about some of these policy issues on a bigger, more systemic, scaled, you know, universal level, when it's so deeply personal for families and individuals. And so we need to honor that deeply personal part of it and the trauma and harm that we've put families through, while also bringing them forward and saying, you know, here's what's possible and here's what you can see as a different path. But I don't think it's an easy one to solve. Yeah. Sure, go ahead.
So I was interested in knowing more about how you go about funding those supportive services and simply making these numbers work out in the community for the elderly. And it's really quite a challenge to be able to provide meaningful services and get the numbers punched such that the Housing Finance Agency and all will bless this, you know, the numbers and approve what you're attempting to do.
Yeah. So a couple things. One is, again, to be, how do you fund services? And it's really hard to do that. You come from a senior housing provider, and the Housing Finance Agency scrutinized that a ton. Yes to all of that. How we fund services, one is to be really clear, we do not fund like full service packages for individuals. So like I said, I want to note that our services kind of end at the door of the unit and pretty much end at the door of the building too, though we obviously try to make community connections, but we're not vocational providers and jobs, and we're not in-home care providers in homes or any of SLS or any of those actual programs. So we don't fund that. We, again, are really supporting other systems that increase funding for those kind of programs because they matter to our residents, but I want to be super clear, we don't deliver those. However, how we fund the services within our building, those inclusion concierge, and then their budget to both have staff and have programming within the building, we build that into an operating expense built within the building as part of, you have like maintenance and property management, and we carry about a $300,000 about annual cost through it. What that does is it hits our ability. We have a mixed income community, so we would be able to take on a mortgage. This is, now we're getting into like maybe development 201. We would be able to take on a mortgage. Obviously, having $300,000 in cost decreases our cash flows and decreases our available dollars to fund debt. And so therefore we have a larger gap up front of dollars that we need to raise for the building because it dips into what we can borrow. And so that really is, on our San Jose community, the Kelsey raised $2.5 million in philanthropy. In our San Francisco community, the Kelsey has raised $5 million in philanthropy that we put into the deal as gap capital to help ensure that we can cover those services through operating expenses. The second sub-benefit of that is that it gives us skin in the game. It's almost like owner equity. So when we did our closing process with our different housing finance partners, banks and public entities, and they said in their value engineering, this is the first thing they want to cut is, why do you have this big resident services budget? And I said, well, if you cut that resident services budget, then I'm taking my $2.5 million. This is the reason I'm putting $2.5 million in this deal is because it has that inclusive community. So we got to figure out what else we can cut, because that's, unless we're going to, cut proportionally our philanthropic commitment to the project, like we can't make it work. And somehow they figured out how to make our underwriting work and keep that in.
So it's you always, I guess the next question would be, in terms of the size of property that you can develop, it has to be, have to be a 40-unit community to make something like that work.
That is a good question. I think our number is exactly that for this current model. However, over the next 5 years, we're looking to do a home ownership, a co-housing, and a small sites model, as well as a market rate model. And that is an exact question that we're studying right now to figure out how could you fund something like that in a small sites model. I think that's a really worthwhile question. Our number is actually that with our level of integration, because we have 25% of homes for people with disabilities, we actually think the number's higher. We actually, right now, our numbers, because we need 2 full-time inclusion concierge, we think it's important to have not just 1, but 2, so that somebody's always on staff. To justify 2 FTEs is really 70 in total units, total unit counts, which also aligns to what tax credits are. But to justify 1, you can be at about 30 to 35 units, but and we have like a little spreadsheet that we calculate that out at. So you're exactly right. We have not solved for it on the smaller scale, and that's something we're looking to do over the next couple of years. Sure, with the scarf open. Okay.
I mean, I know in Chapel I've looked at different affordable housing communities, and you can definitely tell the affordable housing community from the apartment next door. Like you say, the range of rents would go from $490 to $2,200. Would you notice the difference?
No, the units are all the same. The units are all the same, and our units are mostly universally designed, so also we don't have like accessible and non-accessible units. That's one of our principles. The only difference is roll-in showers do not happen throughout the whole building because, one, they're not actually preferred by a lot of people, including people with disabilities, and they also have some other maintenance questions. So our units are all exactly the same in terms of layouts and widths and grab bars and all of that, except for the small number of our units do have roll-in showers and others don't. And this is outlined in our housing design standards too, in the scarf.
What do you think about the current system where we separate older adults from people with disabilities? And we know that people with disabilities are going to grow older, and people who are older have disabilities. I struggle with that dichotomy. Can you talk to that?
And what is older?
Yeah.
Can you repeat what you did?
Can you talk about the current systems that separates older adults and people with disabilities when actually people with disabilities become older and older adults have disabilities? And how do you define older? Like, I don't even know. I thought I was a college student until I walked on UNC yesterday, and then I was like, I am old, so I don't know that. But around the older adults, I do think so. The first thing that everybody said when I was going around doing focus groups, another thing that really was actually, I found disproportion of parents being like, we should build senior housing with homes for people with disabilities. Like that was like sort of a big idea that a lot of parents were floating around, that connection. I'm really inspired by Hope's concept of intergenerational, and I think that's really critical, that we can think broadly, whether through a disability specific lens, through an anyone lens, that intergenerational communities have a lot of inherent value. Europe does that a lot better than us, and there are a lot of examples of that there. And so I would be hugely supportive of us thinking about communities for all ages. And I think we are seeing more older adults also saying that they don't want to live in all similar to how we hear disabled people saying, I don't want to live in all disability-specific housing. We do hear older adults. Some prefer, but a lot are saying, I want to live in these mixed communities and diverse communities. And so I think that the concept of intergenerational is really critical, but not actually all disability and senior, because we can imagine a 22-year-old that's living on their own for the first time, no offense to any older adults, but they might not want to live in a full senior housing. And we can see actually all the reasons. We've talked to property managers who have built those kind of communities who have actually said those are nightmares, that there are not like actually aligned interests, and it's like two totally different and sometimes conflicting communities. So I think intergenerational is the way to go versus others. And I can tell that we are at time, so I will step away, but I'll be hanging around. I'm here through the afternoon.
Thank you, Micaela. Thank you, Micaela. You are an inspiration to us at Hope, and I'm sure everybody in this room. We are going to take a break, long overdue, for 15 minutes now to 11:15. Again, there won't be food out there just now, but we will have lunch in just a little bit. So please take a break, stretch your legs, get some water, and we'll see you back at 11:15. All right, so I'd like to introduce our facilitator for the panel. This is Kelly Friedlander. She is the CEO and principal consultant at Community Bridges Group, and she is going to introduce our panelists in just a second. I did want to let you know that after the panelists and Kelly are done with their presentation and questions that Kelly will ask them, we will have a time of Q&A for the audience as well. Okay, so I'll turn it over to Kelly. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Perfect. So what a wonderful morning we've had. So inspirational to hear from the speakers we've already heard from, and now we get to hear from some experts here in North Carolina. So we're going to be talking about envisioning a disability-forward housing future, and I would like to introduce our panelists. First up is Deja Barber. Deja is currently obtaining her double master's degree in school and rehabilitation counseling, and she is a contracted trainer for the Ability Leadership Project, and she is also contracted with the Disability Rights North Carolina on the COVID vaccine project. Deja's here to bring a lived experience perspective. Next, we have Stephanie Williams. Stephanie's worked in the field of health and human services for over 25 years with the Durham County Department of Social Services, the Family Resource Center of Raleigh, and the Durham Center Alliance Health in North Carolina DHHS Division of Aging and Adult Services. Lots of places. She is currently the Supportive Housing Policy Director for the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services Office of the Secretary, and is responsible for designing and implementing affordable and supportive housing initiatives for people living with disabilities across the state. She also is a volunteer at heart, and she volunteers her time to many charitable causes, including mental health, homelessness, and preserving the legacy of historically Black areas in her Durham community. Next on our panel is Ann Oshel. Ann leads Alliance's community engagement and has led the Community Engagement Alliance since 2012, and she is currently heads up the Community Health and Wellbeing Department at Alliance. This department focuses on social determinants of health, integration of physical and behavioral health, and population health. In her role, she has oversight for priority initiatives including community outreach, supportive housing, system of care, and community change. Prior to coming to Alliance, Ms. Oshel was director of Durham County NC nationally recognized system of care, and also served in various clinical roles in the private sector. Thank you for being here. Next, we have Ryan LaValle. Am I saying that correctly? LaValle. Ryan LaValle. He's a community occupational therapist who has been working in Orange County since 2014, advocating for age friendliness, dementia capability, and affordable housing alongside partners such as partnerships in aging programs, the Orange County Department of Aging, the Miriam Cheek Jackson Center, and Habitat for Humanity. His research and practice focuses on developing community-level programs to support the community leadership, well-being, and participation of older adults. So thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it. We're going to hopefully build upon the conversation that we had this morning, and I'd really love to start with Stephanie. Stephanie, what currently exists in the field of disability-forward housing, and what do you see as the gaps and the opportunities?
So in the state of North Carolina, I will say that we have been actually a forward-thinking state. Many people may not know, but back in 2002, some very smart individuals from the Department of Health and Human Services and North Carolina Housing Finance Agency developed this program called the Targeting Housing Program. And that program is cross-disability housing for individuals with various disabilities. It is affordable because that housing is developed through low-income housing tax credits. What the Department of Health and Human Services asked of North Carolina Housing Finance Agency was to actually set aside 10% of those units that received any tax credits for individuals with disabilities. And then the Department of Health and Human Services providers would actually provide those supportive services for those individuals in those communities. So we actually do have a model in North Carolina. I actually wrote down the Kelsey station in that Ms. Connery talked about. That kind of reminded me of what the targeting program looks like across our state. But what I will say is one of the biggest challenges with our targeting program here in the state, which is in 79 counties across the state, it's the service piece. As many of you know, the state has not quite figured out all of our service pieces to help people live in their community successfully. So that's something that we really have to work on in our state, and the funding for those services. In addition, I just talked with one of my colleagues from North Carolina Housing Finance Agency, and we discussed that one of the things that we have with the targeting program now is a clunky referral system. The demand was not this great in 2002. Right now, there are 19,000 people on that wait list. And so that demand we know is really high, and to try to get people into 7,000, 8,000 units that are developed in the state, that's a lot for 10 people to be responsible for at the Department of Health and Human Services. So we know that we have a clunky referral system which slows down that process for people accessing housing.
Interesting. And what was the waiting list, did you say, 19,000?
19,000,
wow.
Yes.
Okay.
And so that's cross-disability.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Speaking of kind of the clunky referral system, I think something maybe Ryan, you could speak on as far as with the aging population. In your work with older adults, what aspects of disability-forward housing are you seeing that they really want as they age?
Yeah, so as we were listening this morning, I think I had a lot of thoughts going through my head, and quite was struck by how similar a lot of the dynamics of advocacy around older adulthood and aging in community and aging in place sort of mirrored a lot of the similar conversations that we see in this sort of justice work. And so one, I think that it's interesting that we had a moment of trying to figure out what is old, and a little bit of stigma still in the room about claiming that and being okay with saying, yes, I am aging, because if you're not aging, you're dead. So that's a good thing. So we are all aging, right? And at some point, if you are not going to be aging, or at some point, if you are aging, you probably will experience disability. Or your environment will disable you in some capacity. So these two issues are quite interconnected in how we think about the systems and policies that we're working. And as long as we're afraid of saying that we're old, we're going to be afraid to advocate for these sorts of changes in our society. So I encourage you to claim old and to say I am aging and we are all aging together so that we can... We'll talk later. The other aspect that I thought was really interesting is the sort of tension that we heard talked about around the movement for age-friendly communities and how we can build those together. I think we see that between children of older adults and differences in what they think they should be advocating for, and an infantilization of older adults, and saying that you can't live out in the community, you can't drive anymore, because the children of those older adults want to make decisions for people that aren't theirs to make necessarily. So I think there's an interesting tension around stigma and how we sort of remove people's rights and autonomy in living out in community together. And so adding to the idea of if we could all get on the same page, we could make a huge movement for age friendliness, disability friendliness in communities. We can add older adults and the aging community to that coalition, because an age-friendly community is a friendly community, as we say. And so I think that that's a really important thing for us to think about, is that that intergenerational piece contributes to coalition building and advocacy, and that older adults want to be engaged, want to be participating, want to have a voice, and much in the same way that we've seen people get isolated in institutions, older adults have experienced that as well. And oftentimes once you've retired, either people are like, well, bye, or they are trying to find new things for you to do that aren't necessarily what you're interested in doing. So figuring out ways for that voice to still be present is very much something that older adults want to be engaging in. I have other thoughts as well, but we'll get to that.
Okay, thank you. Deja, wanted to ask you, in your opinion, what are the top 2 or 3 needs for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to be able to live fully included in the communities?
Okay, that's interesting. As we all said, this is word of stigmas. As you guys can see, older people don't want to call themselves really older. And then on the example of IDD world, adult children is a word. As the question was asked earlier about parents and the challenges within that, many families that want to realize once their child is 18, they're not an adult. So that changes the whole aspect of housing and living independently and on their own. So it kind of works in the area of what's fully inclusive and what does inclusive mean would be talk to your adult child, doing a plan before they talk about leaving. So that way they know what they want, you know what they want, and everything's clear. Because prime example would be, let's say they don't want to cook. So they have to know where DoorDash is. They have to know the restaurants around the DoorDash. They're 20-something years old. They don't want to cook. Let's be fair. I'm one of those people. So working a plan to make sure that they know what's around them, how to pay bills, how to do all that stuff really defines inclusivity that can be done by the parents and the guardians that are currently with them before they head out the door. So the inclusion coordinators and everything at the current living facilities don't have to worry about that job, because that's also very important. And I guess the second part would be in connection to the DSPs would be in the area of teaching them what exactly it means to have one and truly what they need, what their needs are, as in they can explain what they need the DSP to do, what they need the medical staff to do. A direct support professional. I couldn't remember it for a second, and I just came to my mind. So sorry, we talk acronyms a lot in this world. So direct support professional is a DSP. I think that would be a sense of also what inclusivity means, more of just with the person. As y'all can see, I'm a rehab counselor person, so we do a lot of planning, pre-planning stuff. So that's where kind of my mind is with this, because I feel like if the IDD person knows how they want their life to function, it makes everybody's life easier and makes their needs are met. So that's kind of what that includes. So like pre-planning, discussing, knowing really what they need before the need before the need happens is also the key to inclusivity in the world of IDD.
Great, thank you so much. So we've had it brought up now, I think 3 or 4 times today about maybe this tension that we have sometimes between parents of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and the individual themselves. So have you guys ever seen a instance where those groups or similar groups with aging, as you were saying, kind of individuals who were older and their adult children, have you seen any examples where they've successfully formed a coalition and come up with a shared agenda? I'd love to hear about it if you have.
Let's pass it to Ann.
Ann, okay.
I'd just like to point out that she gave me the question that I can't answer. But I do want to say that I'm happily claiming aging. So, my mom lives in an aging in place community, and she reminded me a few years ago when I turned 55 that I now qualify to live there too. So, that I see that as a good thing. I'm sitting here trying to really think about how to answer that question, because it gets at the heart of how we really transform policy and funding priorities and practice, and at Alliance we are the Medicaid managed care plan for people with behavioral health issues. So we serve those that are receiving services for mental health, substance use, and developmental disabilities. We operate an innovations waiver, which has too long of a wait list. We operate a TBI waiver. And as long as we have kind of been in this space, and I think kind of our tension at times is there's never enough money to pay for the things that people would like for us to pay for, and we are bound by so many regulatory rules that sometimes we don't even get to pay for the things that we want to pay for. And I've gotten some pretty creative around financing, but it always comes down to what a group of people are asking us to do, and what we really can do, and what we should do, and what we should do more of, and what we should have done yesterday. I think this kind of shared policy agenda, and I will say one of the things I've worked in the public system for 30 years. One of the things that I hope has more of a groundswell than it's ever had before is the movement around lived experience. That raising voices at the policy level is hugely important. They do not need to hear from people like me. They need to hear from those who receive services, who experience the system in all the ways that are helpful or not. And I really think that's the other part of this that we have to get on board with. One of the things that we have not stepped too much in the space of, but the work around HOPE will put us in this space, is the reducing the reliance on institutional care for people with all types of disabilities. There is still kind of the thinking that institutional care is what is needed and is what is best. And this even taking a shared risk to think of other options around building communities around people is absolutely where the whole system needs to go next. And one of the things that we might run into as a barrier is the willingness to do it, the funding to make it happen, and then people say, oh no, her child but not mine. So it is worth us thinking about now.
Yeah.
I was just going to add 2 things. I think the first being that when we think about those sorts of communities that are working together, that are diverse, that are intergenerational, I think that we often forget that communities in this country and in our locations have been doing that work and figuring it out for many, many years. They've just not been seen as that. Under-resourced communities or communities that have historically been marginalized and excluded from these systems have been figuring out how to take care of their older adults, have been figuring out how to take care of their young people with disabilities. They have a lot of these skills that have been undervalued and not celebrated within our communities. And I think if we start to shift the way we understand our communities and see abundance first, which is me quoting the Marion Cheek Jackson Center and the values that they push forward, we can learn from these communities and lift them up into leadership. Because if we lift from the bottom, our whole society changes. So recognizing that, I think, is a really important step here in honoring the work that has already been done in those spaces. Secondly, our country and culture have been deeply influenced by Henry Ford, and we just want to put everybody on an assembly line, and if you're not the same, it doesn't work. So diversity doesn't work, right? And in that culture, in that space. And so if we can change how we think about diversity and the generativity that it brings to us and the systems that we put people in, that's why we separate people. That's why we have to create these specific institutions that only serve certain types of people, because it's more efficient for the assembly line, not efficient for our communities and the nourishment and joy that we can create together. So those are my 2 points.
Great. Wonderful, wonderful points. Stephanie, hearing all of that, how can families and individuals with IDD, what are the best opportunities for them to advocate on that state level for change? What are some options that they should be looking at?
So I think getting involved in work groups. We do have, right now, we're working on a strategic housing plan with the Department of Health and Human Services, and people getting involved in that work. Also getting involved with the Olmstead plan that the state has, getting involved in those work groups, and then having your voice heard on Jones Street. I think that is probably the best way to get that, to get your advocacy work done at the state level. But really getting involved in those work groups is probably critical for the state staff that are overseeing different initiatives to hear directly from the community.
Great, thank you so much. Deja, so where do you currently live?
I'm currently in Raleigh, but I'm around the whole triangle, so I've been pretty much everywhere. But I currently live in Raleigh.
You currently live in Raleigh, and you drive to school.
Yeah.
Most days, correct?
Yeah. At least 2 to 3 days a week, I drive to Greensboro for class.
So, what would you need to feel comfortable entering your own housing?
What I would need to feel comfortable, I would say, honestly, I'm a little different because I was pretty much taught independence at a very young age. So I was a little different, and my home background was very, very different. But I think the point in general would be just community understanding, because I feel like community really doesn't understand the word disability at times. They assume it as in a medical term. As when we go back to the medical model, they assume the treatment plans and the medical world, but they don't really know what disability looks like when you leave their offices, when you leave the UNCs, when you leave the Dukes. You don't really know what happens then. So knowing what a person's life is like when they leave the medical facility is important. I think that would change a lot of instances of, oh, you need that form filled out for this, or oh, you need this filled out for this. They would know why when we said we need a medical form filled out, people would understand what that's for. So it's kind of like in that sort of sense. And I guess too, like my other panel has said, just general conversation. I feel like general conversation and policy change is never brought up with somebody with a disability. You kind of just stick us in the housing facility, say, go live, you're good. You're away from mom and dad. Like, you don't want to join politics. You don't want to change anything in your community. Like, it's not pushed to really want to change our communities. I feel like if we were given that option, a lot of us would be a lot more freely to want to join our communities. And we feel like we knew how to go to a city council meeting. We were a part of the city council meeting. They asked specific city council stuff related to disability, or they asked about specific housing conversations. They asked about library accessibility, all that kind of stuff about the city. Getting more direct conversations about the city with the IDD world would, I think, help us feel a lot more willing to want to join the community in a way. Yeah.
And at this point, I'm going to plug that Disability Rights North Carolina has a leadership program called the Ability Leadership Program, and it's for people with disabilities, for family members, and for professionals. And Deja is one of the fabulous instructors for that program. So if you're enjoying what you're hearing,
thanks for the plug, Kelly.
If you go to ALP and see, there will be 2 more cohorts next year, so you can sign up for more information. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about the barriers and the challenges. I would love to just go down and ask each of you, what are you guys excited about right now in the field and what's changing?
I thought I had time. What am I excited about? I'm excited for the new generation that is interested in learning about older adults and working together to create a better world. I think the Gen Zers, as much as they love TikTok, they also love their grandparents. And so I'm seeing a lot more interest in building intergenerational communities, connecting and working together and seeing a future together. So that's very exciting to me. But I'm also excited to see different models coming up that are really naming the fact that our current system isn't serving people who experience disability or older adults in general, or if they do serve them well, it's usually at a very, very, very high cost. And so we're sort of naming that, framing that, and really identifying it as a justice issue that we need to move forward and think about thinking about different systems and different models for doing this work that are rooted in different values and principles, which I think we're naming, and we're seeing some opportunities grow through that collaboration and coalition building across groups.
Fantastic.
There's a lot of things I'm excited about. There's a lot of things I'm nervous about, but I think there's a lot of things I'm excited about in terms of really maximizing the potential. And I love what Deja said about, we need to have a better understanding of community and what it takes to be a full participant in a community. And I'm excited that we're starting to have some of these conversations that we weren't having 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and really trying to create some shared language and reframe and listening to each other in ways that I don't know that we've actually heard each other before. And so I'm excited about people like Deja that are getting ready to take over the world and make it a better place. So I'm excited about that. And I think the other thing that I'm excited about is while there's so many changes in the behavioral health system, and we're now kind of, as we emerge from COVID, even the young people are starting to have different conversations around mental health and mental well-being. And so if we can continue to work on reducing the stigma about that and, changing hearts and minds along that, then I think everything else that seems complicated right now will be so much easier, because we will have gotten to the mountaintop of everybody saying, like, yes, this is what needs to be done, and this is how we can do it. And we're going to include and work together in different ways than we've ever done before. So that I'm most excited about.
Fantastic, thank you. Stephanie.
Ditto to everything that these two have said. But the other thing that I'm excited about is the discussions on diversity and inclusion. We have not always had those conversations, but now that is a part of every conversation when people are thinking about how do we build more housing units? How do we change our service system? Those things are coming up in those conversations, and I'm excited to see what that will bring about in the next few years when we start thinking about our diverse populations. How are we inclusive with our diverse populations? And so I am excited about what we'll have in our near future.
Wonderful. And Deja, what are you most excited about?
I'm excited just because, as all my other panelists have said, we're changing. Everything is changing, but as they said, the young people are getting excited. They want to talk about disability. They want to be a part of disability. They don't mind mentioning it. Yes, we still have challenges. Yes, we get mad, scared, and everything else we deal with disability, but they're not afraid to stress it out to the world and do stuff. And like the Kelsey Project and stuff, like people are trying to make it easier for us, and there's intention, and there's a willingness, and there's a passion for that are a part of the older community to inspire some of the younger community to keep pushing someone to make it even better. So that's what I'm really excited about. And just the point of like organizations like Hope and this whole state is really getting the point of like, we're getting the 1990 babies are now turning 30 and 35, and now we're the adults now. So it's like okay, now it's time for y'all to take over, like, and they're allowing us to take it over. So yeah, so I think that's like that's the most fun part to me personally, because a little bit. So it's like we're getting there to realize like real change comes when you actually do a progression. So yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, we have about 10 minutes left, so I would love to open it up to see if the audience has any questions for a panelist. Tony, see who they ask a question.
So I guess the question that popped in my head is specifically for Deja. Since me as well as a person with a disability, I think that it's appropriate for me to ask this question. So in terms of, I guess, getting out and around in the community and getting involved in your community, I wouldn't know because I wasn't born and raised in the state, but can you talk a little bit about maybe the gaps that you experience in terms of, being able to get around and transport yourself or getting a job or things like that? Can you talk about some of the gaps that you personally experienced?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think the biggest issue with in North Carolina specifically is that when in relation to disability, it's very separate. So it's very like one specific disability focus. So as y'all know, we have multiple organizations that do multiple services, but they do it for specifically one disability. So that's a major gap because I feel like we're not combining together as in one organization to really combat issues like jobs, transportation, like stuff that every disability may be affected by. We're worried about, oh, that's only going to be the spinal for the crew. That's only going to be the autistic crew. Like it's not collaborative work. And I think another gap is just the point of our state's very large. And I think it's the point of, this is a general question, really, a general statement, like transit systems, like all this stuff just needs to make sense for everyone. And if it made sense for everyone, then it wouldn't be a problem for us. I mean, I feel like that's the biggest thing when it comes to just being in the community. If we made it more accessible for everybody, then it wouldn't be an issue just for us. So that is a major gap area too.
Great, thank you, Deja. Who else has a question? I see Cynthia has her hand up.
Anyone on the panel can answer this, but I am specifically talking about Alliance Health. Do you guys not have the TBI apartments that y'all used to have, or is there another way to get funding for housing for TBI clients?
That's an excellent question. Alliance operates the only TBI waiver currently in the state. And we've had it for several years. And And, I think about this a lot because, I've been around long enough and I'm at the tail end and people like Deja are coming up to do better than us, is that, that some of the population served in program eligibility criteria, all of that is so regulated to begin with that we don't have a chance to learn, to form the rules. You play by the rules and then you figure out who got left out. And so when we started the TBI waiver, there were projections of how many people would qualify based on the criteria. And we built it and hardly anybody came. And we spent more time saying, you're not eligible because of this one little thing. And so we changed course and said to the state, like, if this is going to do all that it needs to do, then we need to start changing some of the rules around it. And so once that happened, services began to expand. We opened up the first TBI group home in our catchment area that operates now. It is a step towards independence. So when I say group home, it is not where people go and live forever, whether they want to or not. It's the place where we go to help you really figure out what supports you're going to need and want to become more independent. But there are a number of TBI waiver services, but there's also some eligibility criteria, and if anybody is interested or thinks that they have a loved one that would be eligible for the waiver, please call our access line and we will get you connected to that right information.
Okay, thank you.
TBI is traumatic brain injury. Sorry, thank you.
I'm just confused because you guys have a lot of people that work for Alliance, but they don't actually know things about TBI and things like that. Y'all have a high turnover. So what are you going to do about getting funding for places for people with intellectual disabilities that are, like, for me, I live in Durham County. We do not have any place to service that population. Most places, Wake County has it, Orange County. So I'm just trying to figure out how, what is going to be rectified about that situation.
So that's a great question, and I'm happy to talk to you afterwards about this because there's some specifics to how the waiver operates and what counties are eligible for that and what it pays for and doesn't pay for. So I would be very interested in your perspective about what else it needs to do and what Alliance can do.
Yeah, and maybe Cynthia, you and I can sit together at lunch and chat. So.
Great.
Thank you. Representation matters. And I ran for elected office because I understand that deeply. And we just, finished voting. Election day was how long ago? Some of us cried, but there was a lot to cheer for. And so I guess my question is really centered around bringing people with lived experience not to the table, but to build the table, to address the policies that are creating these criteria and regulations that I'm hearing that are creating the barriers. So as a part of these efforts, we need folks who have the lived experience guiding and providing the solutions and not creating these barriers that then create these tensions. Because what I'm hearing is that the tensions aren't with, communities that would naturally be aligned, but rather folks having to vie for the same pot of money and not getting what they need because it's nuanced. And what we do as policymakers is that we flatten it, and we can't do that. And so what, in terms of thinking of solutions, how are we empowering and making and redefining what leadership looks like around these issues and getting folks elected?
Amen.
I know, amen. So
I don't know who that question goes to, but it's out there.
Yeah, so the state is taking some significant steps to try to include the participation of individuals with lived experience in public policy making. There is still a lot of room for growth. And I think an important thing for everyone in this room to do is when you go to a stakeholder work group, when you go to a committee meeting, if you look around the table and everyone looks the same, or the person that, or the group that you're meeting to discuss services for is not represented in the room, to ask why not and if it's possible for them to be. And I think we also have to remember, when we want to include people with lived experience in policy making decisions, we need to provide them with foundational support that when they come in, they can constructively engage instead of being a token. That means providing them pre-training, providing them the education they need to that when they pull up to the table, when they come to that table, they have kind of a similar background to the rest of the professionals that are there. And it also includes reducing economic barriers. We know transportation's a challenge, and if everyone else at the table is there and is being paid to be there, why shouldn't we offer at least some type of compensation for the time, energy, and expertise of people with lived experience when they go to those tables? So, and I think that there's a lot of people in public policy and a lot of people at DHHS who agree with all of that philosophy, and it's just a matter of bringing it up and being an active advocate for that in the system.
Kelly, I can give one quick example to you specifically related to voting. Many people don't realize I asked a few people on Monday, and I was like, well, who'd you vote for? And they said, I just voted for the people I saw in the commercials. Mm-hmm. So in the situation of IDD, there is no educational training, there's no policy development. We don't know what policies you're even talking about to give our input on. So as Kelly said, in those sort of situations, it's a lot of training, it's a lot of pre-work, it's a lot more pre-work than what we want to put in or what we have put in to really help the person understand to really make the change. So it's like, if we don't teach them or make sure they know, then how are we really going to make a change? So.
I see another hand raised back there.
So my question is that a lot of what we've been talking about this morning with the potential Hope housing community is aspirational. We're addressing the issues of the affordable housing, inclusive affordable housing, and how a lot of people have to live with their parents or other relatives, or they have to live in group homes. But until we have the Hope community, what is there available now for inclusive affordable housing besides living with relatives and group homes? How can those of us who are looking for that in the meantime be on the lookout for other options?
So I don't know if you want to talk about, I think first, if this is important to you, how can you become more involved? And I know that Hope is asking people who are interested in volunteering in various capacities if they want to sign up to volunteer. As far as identifying current options, I think a lot of times your best bet would be going to your local managed care entity. So for this area, Raleigh-Durham area, it's Alliance.
One of the, because, we, the first time that the founders of Hope reached out to us, I was like, where have you been my entire life? And why has it taken us so freaking long to have somebody come to us and say, we want this to happen? And it was clear they were not going away. And so it is the advocacy of that, and that will both kind of create the opportunities that Hope says, and what I will say now at Alliance is we do a lot of capital investments into housing. We've spent over $7 million of our own money creating set-asides with 15-year deed restrictions exclusive to the people that we serve, that reduces all the housing barriers. And one of the things that we require of everybody that works on that property is that they attend training from us, from mental health first aid to And we hand select supportive services in a lot of the projects that we do. And to answer your question truthfully, though, to do exactly what you're describing, we do it one person at a time, one project at a time, one plan of care at a time. And when it works, it's great. And when it doesn't work or you can't figure it out, it's heartbreaking. And I'm just going to say kind of one thing a little bit to what Stephanie said, and I can say this because I don't work in state policy. So when she talked about the 19,000 people on targeted units, because I think that is what exists now in North Carolina as an opportunity to do better and do more. And every year when they release the QAP, which is the Qualified Allocation Plan about where they fund housing, every year we go through the ritual of saying, instead of 10% set aside for targeted units, you should do 20% of set aside for targeted units. Other states have done that. There's no reason why we can't. Alliance invests in that gap between 10% and 20% in these units using our own money. That should be a state responsibility to do that. And I think with all the existing 10% targeted units, if we just went to 20% by a policy reform, that 19,000 people would boom. And then we would have kind of, a concentration of units to do some of the really innovative supportive services. So, that's where I hope we have some collective voices to really change that policy barrier into being able to do more. And I might get in trouble for saying that.
Yes, she is. No, but I will go back to the advocacy with our, leaders. I think that is critical because, as Ann mentioned, yes, those 19,000 units would become available, but we have to have the resources to make those units affordable. And so you need the rental assistance piece too. So North Carolina Housing Finance Agency has done a great job of building the units, but to make them affordable, like someone mentioned earlier, I think it was Laura, when she had the slide up about how much it costs for someone to afford a unit, we have to layer that with some type of rental assistance to make it affordable for the people that we're serving. And so that's the other piece of this. We can build the units, we can develop the programs, but if we don't have that rental assistance piece, the person still will not be able to live there long term. So that's the other piece we need advocacy for.
Yeah, and I just wanted to, we've got to end the Q&A, but I just wanted to tag on to what Kelly said, and that is, I mentioned our collective impact grant, and we'll talk about it again at the end of the day, but in case you don't make it to the end of the day, I just want to say it now, is that we need everybody in this room and all of your networks to be part of the collective impact work, because what your question about what do we do now, is that we need this impact to be broader than just waiting for One Hope development. We need the impact to be all the things that Ann and Stephanie and everybody just said, that we're changing the way things are done, the way people think about things related to intergenerational inclusive housing. And when you change things, it's very challenging. And so we need a lot of good experience from all these different perspectives to make it happen. So that's, it isn't going to change overnight, unfortunately, but we can make a difference if we all work together. And Micaela was going to come up just to close us out for her last thoughts, and then we are going to break for lunch.
So I'm going to do a couple summary remarks from this amazing panel, so thank you all, but I'm going to put it back to you at the very end. So I'll tell you the question first, which is the magic wand question, which is my favorite thing. In one sentence, if you could pass one policy, create one fund, build one thing, what's your lotto question, whatever it is, what's the one thing you would do for a disability forward housing future? So we'll go through after I do a summary of what's your thing. So be thinking of that, I'll precede that. But I think not much to say besides a couple themes that I think, we heard here. Obviously the role for policy and how we actually bring those folks, whether lived experience of developing housing and seeing where the gaps are and what's needed to change it, or critically important lived experience of disability and feeding that into our policy spaces. I do think too that we here in North Carolina, we have to really think, and we think about this in California too, where are our levers of policy impact, what needs to happen locally versus what needs to happen at the state level versus what needs to happen at the federal level, because there are different spaces of movement. And actually, you might say your state is a lost cause, but there's some federal action. I'm not saying that, but there are some federal actions. There are some federal actions that would actually force movement on your state level. So actually, that's where you want to concentrate. And then there's some local actions that will really tactically get things done. So really bridging that two piece. I think the other thing, and this is an incredibly, talk about spaces where parents and people with disabilities are a part of community together. I think we're seeing the start of that here. And I think we have a lot of that embedded in our work at the Kelsey too, of that it is not, and sort of my remarks are not about sort of, it's, family members versus self-advocates. It's actually saying we have incredible power when we align together, and we see that power building in this room today. So how cool and how powerful for what we can do. And I think the third piece is borrowing from what we've seen that has already worked. I think whether that be looking at communities on the ground who know these practices of care and community and collectivism, or we look at, managed care spaces or veterans housing or senior housing, and how, we've got a lot of the solutions out there already. It's just a matter of us putting resources behind them to bring them to the work that we aim to do. So awesome panel. Thank you for that. And I will pass it for the magic wand as a rapid fire.
Okay, magic word. I would say would be more collaboration. That simple.
I would say funding.
I would say collaboration and funding.
Whew. I was thinking a sentence. Y'all made it 2 words. I was going to say those who are most marginalized and impacted by injustice are leading.